Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I never expected to face something so strange in such a quiet place. I moved in because the street felt calm and almost empty. No cars passed after 9 at night. Neighbors kept to themselves. I liked that. It was my first big decision after changing jobs. I wanted a peaceful routine with less noise and fewer distractions. I thought this house would give me that. The real estate listing described the property as spacious, with 2 floors and a small backyard. It mentioned an upstairs bathroom with a vintage-style tub. I didn't care too much about the tub's design, but the rest of the house looked good in the photos. When I visited, everything was in order. The walls were clean. The rooms felt large. The living room had enough space for a couch and a TV stand. The kitchen had decent appliances. The upstairs bedroom had a view of the backyard and a nearby row of tall pine trees. The landlord told me the place had been rented out a few times before, but the tenants never stayed long. He attributed that to their job changes or personal reasons. It didn't bother me. I signed the contract and moved in 2 weeks later. During the first few nights, I slept well. The house was so quiet it almost felt like wearing noise-canceling headphones. Around me, there was barely any traffic. Sometimes I heard a dog barking far off, but that was it. Even the refrigerator's motor sounded loud in comparison to the neighborhood's silence. I spent my free time watching movies, cooking simple meals, and occasionally talking to a friend on the phone. Everything seemed fine. But on the 5th night, something weird happened. It was around 2 in the morning. I woke up because of running water above me. My bedroom was right under the upstairs bathroom. At first, I thought I had left the faucet dripping before bed. I got up, turned on the light in the hallway, and walked up the stairs. My legs felt shaky because I was half asleep. When I reached the bathroom, I saw the tub's faucet running at full blast. Water splashed against the porcelain surface and was about an inch away from overflowing. I quickly shut it off. My heart pounded. I stood there in my shorts and t-shirt, staring at the swirling water. I checked the handle. It was turned all the way to the right, as if someone had cranked it open. That made no sense to me. I knew I hadn't used the tub at all that day. I drained some of the water, then I dried my hands and shook off the uneasy feeling. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the faucet was loose or there was some pressure issue. I wiped the floor and went back to bed. In the morning, I inspected the faucet, turning it on and off. It seemed normal. I looked under the sink for any leaks or odd connections. Everything appeared fine. I shrugged it off and went to work, but it stayed on my mind. 2 nights later, the same thing occurred at nearly 3 in the morning. I woke up to rushing water again. This time, it sounded even louder, as if the tub was about to overflow. My chest tightened. I hurried up the stairs, flicked on the bathroom light, and saw water just a 1/4 inch from the edge. Again, the faucet was fully open. I twisted it off and stood there, breathing heavily. My bare feet got wet from the small puddle on the tiles. I muttered a few curses under my breath and tried to steady my heartbeat. After cleaning up the water, I went back to bed, though my mind spun with questions. How was this happening? The next day, I decided to call a plumber. I had to pay out of my own pocket, but it felt worth it for peace of mind. The plumber arrived in the afternoon. He checked the pipes, the seals, the water pressure, and the faucet assembly. He even went under the house to inspect the main line. An hour later, he came back inside and shrugged. He said everything looked normal. No leaks, no faulty parts, and no reason for the faucet to turn on by itself. He suggested maybe the handle was loose, but he tested it. Nothing was loose. He left me a bill and went on his way. That night, I made sure to close the bathroom door. I placed a folded towel under the faucet handle, hoping it would keep the handle from turning if there was some strange pressure surge. But at around 2:30 in the morning, I was jolted awake by the same gushing noise. My entire body tensed. My ears rang with the sound of water echoing in the stillness. I forced myself out of bed, heart pounding. I felt a knot in my stomach. When I opened the bathroom door, the towel I had placed was on the floor, completely soaked. The faucet was fully open again. The tub was about to spill over. I shut off the water with a trembling hand. A few drips fell onto the tile, making me flinch. My chest was tight, and my breathing was shallow. I stared at the tub, half expecting something or someone to appear behind me in the mirror. But I was alone. I couldn't sleep after that. I stayed in the living room, the TV playing some infomercial, volume low. My thoughts kept circling around what I had seen. I tried to think logically, but nothing explained why the faucet kept turning on in the middle of the night. Around 5 in the morning, I dozed off on the couch. I woke up 2 hours later, exhausted. I called the landlord that afternoon, wanting an explanation. He sounded hesitant. He admitted that previous tenants had mentioned the same issue. He said it had been happening for years, but no plumber had ever found a problem. Then he added something that made my skin crawl. The original owner of the house, the person who built it, had apparently died in that upstairs bathroom, supposedly drowning in that tub. The landlord mumbled that detail, like he didn't want to say it out loud. He claimed he never told me because he didn't think it was relevant and because it wasn't something that legally had to be disclosed. I felt my face get hot. My palms started sweating. I cursed under my breath, feeling both frustrated and a bit creeped out. After that call, my perspective on the house changed. I went from feeling safe to feeling on edge. I started noticing small things, like cold spots in the hallway or faint dripping sounds when there shouldn't be any water running. My nerves got worse every evening. I would lie in bed, anticipating that moment when the water started blasting upstairs. Some nights it didn't happen, which left me even more jittery. I'd doze off around midnight, wake up every hour listening. Other nights it happened right on schedule, between 2 and 3 in the morning. Each time I jumped out of bed, ran up the stairs and shut off the faucet, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. My muscles felt tense. My chest felt tight. Every time I walked into that bathroom, a chill spread across my shoulders. I tried ignoring it, thinking it would stop eventually, but it didn't. I set up my phone to record video in the bathroom one night. I placed it on a chair, pointing at the tub and faucet. I hit record and went to bed around midnight. At exactly 2:30, the sound of water woke me up. I rushed in, turned off the faucet, then stopped the recording. The next morning, I played the video. I saw nothing until the exact moment the faucet blasted open. It went from dry to gushing in a split second. The handle appeared to move on its own, rotating as if an invisible hand was pushing it. There was no movement in the rest of the bathroom. I couldn't see any shadow or figure, just that handle turning. Watching it gave me goosebumps. I started avoiding the bathtub during the day. I used the downstairs shower instead. Sometimes I would open the bathroom door upstairs just a crack to peek inside, my heart hammering, expecting to see water running. When it was off, I felt a small wave of relief, but it never lasted long. My nights turned into a pattern of broken sleep and anxiety. My hands would shake when I climbed the stairs in the dark. I double-checked the faucet every night before bed, turning it so tight that my wrist hurt. It didn't matter. It always turned on at that late hour. The same sudden roar of water hitting porcelain. After a few weeks, I felt exhausted. My job performance was slipping because I couldn't concentrate. I found myself making mistakes, forgetting details in meetings, and yawning through the day. My boss asked if everything was okay at home. I lied and said I was just stressed about personal stuff. I didn't want to mention a rogue bathtub that seemed to have a mind of its own. That sounded ridiculous, but it was my reality every single night. One weekend, I took it upon myself to check every pipe in the house. I crawled under the sinks, behind the toilets, and even up into the attic to see if there was some hidden water line. I wore gloves and used a flashlight, shining it into dark corners. Dust coated my arms and face. My back ached from bending and squatting. But I found nothing unusual. The upstairs plumbing was straightforward. The tub's pipes connected to the main water line behind the wall, and they were in good condition. There were no leaks or faulty valves. Everything was normal, except for the fact that the faucet turned itself on at night. My landlord suggested maybe I could keep paying rent, but move out early if I really couldn't handle it. He offered to let me break the lease without a penalty if I found someone else to take over. Part of me wanted to leave immediately, but I had just moved in. The thought of packing up again annoyed me. I was also curious. How could this be happening? And more importantly, how could I stop it? I tried turning off the main water valve before bed one night. That was a bit inconvenient because it meant I had no running water if I needed the bathroom at night, but I was desperate to see if it changed anything. So I shut off the water supply around 11 at night. I went to bed. Sure enough, around 2:30 in the morning, I still woke up. This time I heard a faint banging sound, like pipes rattling under pressure. My pulse quickened. When I went upstairs, the faucet was off. No water came out, but the handle was turned all the way open and the pipe was making a low vibration. I could hear a soft humming noise. It reminded me of water trying to force its way through. I stood there with a racing heartbeat, looking at that handle. I reached out and turned it back to the closed position. The humming stopped. My arm hair stood on end. That was the moment I realized I couldn't fix this. The plumber couldn't fix it. The landlord knew about it for years. The house itself had this bizarre trait. Whether I called it paranormal or some unknown plumbing quirk, I didn't care anymore. I wanted out. Over the next week, I spoke to a coworker who was looking for a place to rent. I was honest, but not overly detailed. I said I had found the neighborhood too quiet and preferred a different location. He liked the area and was happy to take over the lease. Once we signed all the paperwork, I started packing. On my last night in that house, the faucet turned on again at 2 in the morning. I heard the rush of water, walked upstairs, and turned it off for the final time. My hands trembled, but a wave of relief washed over me. I knew I wouldn't deal with it anymore. I left the next day. I never found out if the new tenant encountered the same nightly disturbance, but I had a feeling he would. Maybe he would call me, or maybe he wouldn't. I was just glad to be gone. That's my story. No matter how quiet and welcoming a place might seem, sometimes there's something beneath the surface that defies normal explanation. I didn't solve the mystery. I didn't make it disappear. But I got away from it, and I haven't looked back. I still live in the same city, just a different neighborhood, and I have no desire to visit that old house or its upstairs bathroom ever again. I couldn't shake off the tension from the moment I got that phone call. My brother's voice was louder than usual, and he spoke fast. He said he saw me standing in my front yard, wearing my old red shirt, watering the plants like nothing was out of the ordinary. That didn't make sense because I was in another city that entire weekend on a work trip. The idea of someone who looked just like me roaming around my property made my stomach tighten. I came back home and tried to figure out if this was some weird prank or if I was losing my mind. I left for my trip on a Friday morning. I drove 3 hours to a small town where my company held a seminar. My schedule was tight, filled with presentations, meetings, and a group dinner. I stayed at a modest hotel near the venue. Everything went as expected until Saturday afternoon when my phone rang. It was my brother Dave. He sounded surprised and a bit confused. He asked, "Why didn't you say you were back? I just saw you outside your house." I told him he had to be mistaken because I was still out of town. He paused for a moment, said he was absolutely sure he saw me in my yard, then repeated that he even honked his horn. He claimed this other me waved at him with a casual motion, as if nothing strange was going on. He asked if I was messing with him, or if I had come home early. I said no. I heard him take a breath and he said, "Well, that's weird," then hung up. The rest of my trip was a blur. I went through the motions, finished the seminar, exchanged business cards, and tried to keep my head in the game. But I felt an uneasy chill whenever I remembered Dave's tone of voice. He's not the type to imagine things. He's solid, grounded, and likes to joke around, but not about stuff like this. On Sunday, I packed my bags early and headed home. I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept replaying that phone call in my head. When I got back that evening, everything looked normal at first. The front door was locked. The windows were shut. The yard looked the same as when I left. The flower bed was a little dry because I didn't water it, so that made me wonder what Dave actually saw. It definitely didn't look like anyone had been tending the garden. Nothing looked tampered with inside. The house was quiet. My living room was just how I left it. I went to the kitchen and checked the back door, finding it locked. My spare key was in its usual spot, hidden behind a loose brick by the door, but it hadn't moved. No footprints around that area, just some dried leaves. The next morning, I decided to ask around. My next-door neighbor, Sandra, was home. I walked over, knocked on her door, and waited. She opened it with a friendly smile, then immediately asked if I was okay. I said yes, why wouldn't I be? She said she noticed me, well, someone she thought was me, outside in my yard on Saturday morning. She assumed I had come home early, but found it odd that I didn't say hello or mention my trip. She said she called my name over the fence, but the figure just gave her a small nod and continued watering the plants. She noticed I looked a bit pale, or at least that's what she said. I felt a jolt in my stomach. When I asked if she was sure it was me, she said, "Well, I guess it wasn't, but it sure looked like you from where I was standing." My chest felt tight. I tried to keep calm, but I felt sweat prickling at my forehead. I explained to Sandra that I was out of town all weekend. She looked confused. She insisted the person looked like me, but the skin seemed off somehow. I didn't know what to say. I thanked her for letting me know and walked back to my place. My heart was pounding. This was the second person to confirm they saw my double. I had no idea what was happening. I started checking every inch of my yard. I looked at the grass for any footprints or disturbed patches of soil. I saw a few faint outlines, like someone had stood in one spot near the garden hose, but it might have been older. I had no way of telling for sure. The garden hose was coiled up as I'd left it. The spigot was turned off. The ground around the flower bed was dry. Nothing indicated someone actually watered those plants. My red shirt was inside the house in the laundry hamper. I went to check. Sure enough, it was still there, waiting to be washed. I felt a wave of nausea. If my red shirt was in the hamper, then whoever was outside was wearing something identical. My mind started racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a stranger, but how did they look just like me? Maybe it was a trick of the light, but Dave and Sandra both saw this person close up. I called Dave and asked him for more details. He described the scene with clarity. He was driving by, saw me, slowed down, and honked. The person turned, waved with the left hand, and continued tending the garden. Dave said the person looked normal except the face was a little blank, like there wasn't much expression. Dave assumed I was busy or something. He drove off without a second thought until we spoke on the phone. After hearing that, I felt a heaviness in my chest. I tried to stay calm, but that night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing random sounds like creaks and groans from the floorboards. I stayed in bed staring at the ceiling. My stomach felt tight. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured someone with my face standing in my yard, wearing that red shirt, staring back at me. I wanted answers. On Tuesday, I took the day off work to investigate further. I live in a small neighborhood, so I walked around to see if anyone else might have noticed something. Most people were at their jobs, but I spoke to an older man who was watering his own lawn on the next block. I asked if he saw anyone around my house on Saturday. He said no, he hadn't paid attention. He did mention that sometimes random solicitors come by, but they usually carry flyers or ring doorbells. I was getting nowhere with that. I called my homeowner's insurance hotline to see if they had any advice. They suggested I check if there were any signs of forced entry, or if anything was stolen. But there was nothing missing. Everything was in place. They recommended installing a security camera, or at least a doorbell camera. I decided that was a good idea, so I drove out to the local electronics store and got a simple camera system. It wasn't very expensive, just a small motion-activated camera I could set up near the front door. I spent the afternoon installing it, following the instructions step by step. By the time I finished, I felt a bit better. like I was doing something productive. The next day, I went back to work. My coworkers asked how my trip went, and I gave them a basic summary. I left out the weird story because I didn't want people to think I was paranoid. I tried to focus on my tasks. I worked through spreadsheets, answered emails, and met with my boss about a client. But I couldn't get my mind off the situation at home. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach jumped. I kept expecting Dave or Sandra to call me and say they saw me out there again. When I got home that evening, I checked the camera footage. Nothing interesting showed up. Just me leaving in the morning, me coming back in the afternoon, and the mail carrier dropping off a package. I felt a strange sense of relief, but also a lingering tension. I realized I was hoping to see something, to prove I wasn't imagining this entire scenario. At the same time, I was scared of seeing some stranger with my face walking around my yard. I decided to keep the camera rolling every day. Over the next few days, I talked to Dave again. He said he hadn't seen anything else. I asked him if he might have dozed off while driving or maybe saw someone who just resembled me. He got defensive and insisted he knew what he saw. We got into a small argument. He told me he wouldn't bring it up anymore if I was going to accuse him of lying. I apologized. I told him I just wanted to make sense of it all. Saturday morning came around, exactly 1 week after the incident. I got up early, brewed coffee, and sat on my porch. The sky was clear, the air was a bit crisp. I was on edge, staring at every person who walked by. I felt my pulse beat in my neck. I was expecting a repeat scenario, but nothing happened. No one came near my yard, and I didn't see any suspicious cars. By noon, I relaxed a little. I went inside, heated a frozen pizza, and watched some TV to distract myself. My phone was silent for most of the day. That afternoon, I went outside to do actual yard work. I wore an old gray t-shirt, not the red one, which was still in the laundry hamper. I turned on the hose and watered the flowers. As I did, I looked around to see if anyone was watching. Everything seemed normal. Sandra was out getting groceries, judging by the empty driveway. Dave's car wasn't parked anywhere nearby. I was alone. Nothing felt out of place, aside from my own nerves. I finished the watering, turned off the spigot, and coiled up the hose. Then I went back inside. I checked the camera footage on my phone. It showed me in my gray shirt, watering the garden. That looked normal, no double. Still, my heart was racing while I watched it. I wondered if the camera would catch any glitch, but it didn't. I stayed in for the rest of the day, just doing laundry and cooking dinner. I went to sleep that night feeling a bit uneasy. Every little sound outside made me flinch. Sunday morning, I decided to knock on Sandra's door again and ask if she remembered any small detail about the person in the yard. She said she didn't see the person's face clearly, just noticed they had the same build as me and wore a red shirt. She was sure the hair color was mine, though. She recalled that the person held the hose in a stiff way, almost mechanical, but she only glanced for a few seconds before going inside. She assumed it was me. She apologized for not looking closer. I told her not to feel bad. Over the following week, nothing else happened. No sightings, no phone calls from Dave about seeing me in places I wasn't. The camera footage only showed my normal comings and goings, plus the mail carrier and a couple of neighbors passing by. Still, I couldn't relax. I felt a weird sensation whenever I stepped outside. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone who looked exactly like me. I checked my locks every night, tested the windows, and looked for any sign that someone had been messing around. Everything seemed locked up and solid. The red shirt was still in my hamper. I finally decided to wash it just to break the strange hold it had on my thoughts. When I tossed it in the washing machine, I felt my hands shaking. I pressed the start button, and the hum of the machine filled the laundry room. I stood there for a moment, watching the water fill the basin. I took a deep breath to calm my nerves. I never discovered who that person was, or why they looked like me. My brother still brings it up sometimes, usually when we're hanging out. He jokes about my evil twin or calls it some weird trick of the universe. Sandra avoids the topic. She seems uncomfortable whenever it comes up. And me, I just live with the unsettling memory. I can't explain it. I don't have any evidence except for the testimonies of two people I trust. It never happened again, as far as I know, but I check my camera footage every week just to be sure. I keep expecting to see that stiff figure in a red shirt waving at me from my own front yard. It hasn't happened yet, but the thought still makes my heart pound. I don't like to talk about it much, but it's always there in the back of my mind. I tell this story because it's one of the strangest things I've ever experienced. I wasn't looking for anything bizarre. I was just going through my normal life, traveling for work, and minding my business. Then I came home to find that someone had shown up in my place, wearing clothes like mine, waving at my own brother. It left a mark on me. It made me more cautious. I check the doors and windows a bit more obsessively now. I glance at strangers' faces longer than I should. Sometimes I even check my reflection in the mirror and wonder if I'll ever see something I can't explain. So far, it's just me staring back. The same face I've always known. But I still remember that phone call, the confusion in my brother's voice and the neighbor's claims. That's something I can't just forget. I moved into the new condo a week ago. On my first night, I heard a low hum coming from the central air conditioning system. I thought it was normal. New buildings sometimes have quirks. By the second night, the noise got under my skin. I sat up in bed, listening to a muffled, repetitive drone that seemed to rise and fall at random intervals. It wasn't just airflow. It sounded more like distant voices, but I couldn't make out any words. My heart pounded. I felt a knot in my gut. I told myself it was just the AC. Still, I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling. By the third night, I was tired from unpacking and from work. I dozed off around 10. An hour later, I snapped awake because I heard my name. It was faint, buried in the hum of the vents. I froze, holding my breath, hoping I had imagined it. Then I heard something again. My name, repeated by a raspy whisper, drifting in from somewhere inside the walls. My heart hammered. I got out of bed. My legs felt shaky, but I forced myself to check around. Every light was off except the small lamp near the couch. The noise followed me from the bedroom to the living room, always out of reach. I felt like I was chasing a shadow. I decided to shut off the air conditioner to make sure I wasn't mixing up normal mechanical sounds with something else. I walked over to the thermostat. My hand was trembling. I pressed the button to turn the system off. The fan stopped. The condo fell silent except for my own breathing. I felt a small rush of relief. Then I heard it again, a soft scraping through the ductwork. It moved overhead like something crawling through the vents. My scalp tingled. My arms broke out in goosebumps. I stood frozen, not sure where to go. I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself it could be a loose part in the ventilation, or maybe the duct was expanding and contracting with the change in temperature. But it didn't sound like metal. It felt closer, like a whisper running across the walls. I moved slowly toward the living room. The largest vent was near the ceiling, behind a decorative grill. The lights were on low, casting shadows across the space. When I got close, I heard my name again. The voice was rough, like someone who had smoked for 20 years. I swallowed hard. My mouth went dry. I called out, asking if anyone was there. Nothing answered, but I felt my skin crawling. The fine hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned on all the lights. It was 2 a.m, and I was wide awake, searching for an explanation. I checked every room. I looked inside closets, even though I knew nobody was there. I still felt that presence. It made my stomach churn. Eventually, I grabbed my phone and called the building's after-hours emergency line. I told them I was hearing strange sounds coming from the vents. The guy on the phone sounded half asleep. He said someone could come out in the morning to check it. That was it. I spent the rest of the night on the couch with all the lights on. I kept staring at that grill on the living room wall. Sometimes I heard faint clicking noises, but they faded after a while. At dawn, I finally fell asleep. I woke up around 9 to a phone call from the maintenance team. They scheduled a visit for the afternoon. I felt a bit better knowing professionals would look at it. I told myself they would find some simple reason behind all this. Maybe there was a leak or a small piece of debris caught in the ducts. They arrived around 2. 2 guys in uniforms carried a ladder and some tools. I walked them through the condo, explaining what happened. They seemed polite but skeptical. One of them climbed the ladder and removed the grill in the living room. He pointed a flashlight into the duct, checking for blockages. They both spent about an hour going through the system. I hovered near them, feeling uneasy but trying not to show it. They tested the thermostat, checked the filters, listened for unusual sounds. After a while, one of them shrugged and said everything seemed fine. The other guy nodded. They told me there were no leaks, no loose components, no obvious issues. They suggested I might be hearing typical expansion noises or air pressure changes. They offered to schedule a more thorough inspection if it continued, but for now they had nothing else to report. I felt a mix of relief and frustration. On one hand, there wasn't a serious mechanical problem. On the other hand, they basically told me it was all normal. I knew what I heard. It was my name, spoken in a voice that didn't sound mechanical at all. But I thanked them, and they left. I tried to go about my day. I still had boxes to unpack and furniture to organize. Around 5 in the afternoon, I heard that low hum again. This time it was quieter, like a slow vibration in the background. I tried to ignore it. I made dinner, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. By 9, I was exhausted. I turned off the lights and went to bed. My sleep didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke up sweating. The AC was on, circulating cool air, but I felt hot. I heard a faint buzz in the background, then something like a whisper. I got out of bed and stood there listening hard. I felt the blood pumping in my ears. The whisper said my name again. Alex. Alex. I jerked around, looking for any source of the sound. It felt like it was coming from the corner of the room where the vent connected to the ceiling. My throat felt tight. My heart was racing. I turned on the lamp beside the bed. I decided to shut off the system again, just to confirm. This time I dashed out to the thermostat, hit the off switch, and waited. The fan stopped. The rush of air died down. My breathing sounded too loud in my own ears. Then I heard a faint scraping sound move from the bedroom vent to the hallway vent. I ran to the hall, flipping lights as I went. I stood under the vent, holding my breath. It was quiet. I walked back to the living room. The large vent was open again, the same one the maintenance guys had messed with. The metal grill was still there, but the center part had a small gap, probably from when they removed it earlier. I swear I saw a slight movement behind it, like a flicker of shadow. I felt my chest tighten. I couldn't think of anything to do except stare. I was sweating hard, and my hands felt clammy. Then the whisper came again, close to the vent. Alex. I jumped back, nearly slipping on the hardwood floor. I grabbed my cell phone. I didn't know if I should call security or the police, but what would I say? That my air vents were calling my name? I needed to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I went outside, down the corridor, and I checked the other units. Most people had their doors closed, and it was late. I listened for any strange sounds in the hallway. Everything was quiet. I returned to my condo, heart pounding. I locked the door behind me. I stood there staring at the vent. I wanted to be somewhere else, but I also wanted to prove to myself that this was real. I pulled a chair over to the wall and climbed up to inspect the vent closely. I placed my ear near the gap. My muscles felt tight, and my mouth was parched. For a moment, I heard nothing. Then I felt a slight rush of air against my ear. The whisper said my name again, soft but distinct. Alex. My stomach flipped. I almost dropped my phone. I jumped off the chair and ran to the couch. I sat there breathing fast, wiping sweat from my forehead. I wondered if this was some elaborate prank. Maybe someone had installed a weird speaker system. The thought didn't make me feel better. It just made me angry. I decided to contact the condo management first thing in the morning. That night, I barely slept. The next day, I visited the management office as soon as they opened. I described everything I had experienced. The woman at the desk raised her eyebrows. She pulled up my file and saw the maintenance request from the day before. She asked if they had found anything. I told her they hadn't, but the situation was getting worse. She said she would schedule a more comprehensive inspection, including a look at the building's main AC system. She apologized for the inconvenience. I appreciated that, but it didn't calm my nerves. I left, feeling on edge. The second inspection happened that afternoon. A different crew came, more specialized. They had better equipment. They checked the ductwork in my unit and also in the utility rooms on my floor. They spent a good 2 hours here, scanning for any signs of leaks or hidden issues. When they finished, the main guy told me everything seemed intact. He said the only noise they picked up was normal air circulation. I insisted they hadn't been here at night, so maybe they wouldn't hear what I hear in the early hours. They looked at each other. I could tell they didn't believe me. They packed up and left. I felt more isolated after that. I knew I wasn't imagining things. My body's reactions were real. The sweat, the tension, the jolts of fear. I called a friend who lived across town and told him about it. He sounded concerned, but he also suggested I might be experiencing stress or sleep issues. I had started a new job recently. Moving into a new place is always tough. He suggested I see a doctor. I told him I'd think about it. But deep down I knew this wasn't stress. There was something in the building, in the ducts, calling my name. Over the next few nights, the pattern continued. Usually around midnight or 1 in the morning, I'd hear the hum rising. Then I'd hear the whispering. Sometimes it said my name once or twice. Other times I heard soft breathing like someone gasping for air. My chest would tighten and I'd feel trapped. I started sleeping with the TV on, hoping the background noise would cover it. It didn't. I tried earplugs. That only made me more conscious of the vibrations traveling through the floors. One evening I tried a different approach. I waited until I first heard the whisper. Then I grabbed a broom handle and banged on the vent, hoping to scare off whatever might be there. I shouted, telling it to stop. My voice echoed in the empty living room. My fists felt sore from gripping the broom so hard. I kept shouting for a few minutes, then silence. I waited, heart pounding. Suddenly there was a scratching noise from the vent in the hallway. I charged out there, brandishing the broom like a weapon. I slammed it against the grill. More scratching, moving fast toward the bedroom vent. It was like it was taunting me. My adrenaline spiked. I followed the noise to the bedroom. I stood under the vent with the broom, shouting again, but I didn't hear anything else. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped the broom. I stayed in the living room the rest of the night with every light on. I felt like a fool, but I also didn't know what else to do. I had called maintenance twice. I had no solid proof to show them. I couldn't record anything. Every time I tried to record with my phone, the whispers didn't come through clearly. All I got was a low static and maybe a muffled hiss. At work, I felt distracted. I kept thinking about the nights and how I dreaded going home. I even considered sleeping in a hotel, but that seemed expensive and inconvenient. I talked to the condo management again. They said they'd keep my complaint on file, but they had no further suggestions. When I pressed, they said no one else in the building had reported anything like this. That night, I came home and cooked dinner. I tried to keep my mind off everything. Around 11, I paced the living room, feeling that tension build inside me. Midnight approached. I stared at the vent, waiting. I hated feeling helpless. I hated waiting. The hum started like before. My heart pounded faster. I switched off the AC again, hoping for silence. It didn't help. The scraping returned, sliding through the ducts. I pressed my ear against the wall, hearing it shift from the living room to the hallway. Then it moved toward the bedroom. My throat felt tight. My breathing got shallow. I whispered to myself that I would find a solution. I refused to let this thing take control of my life. I marched into the hallway and turned the lights on. I followed the noise to the bedroom. The vent was near the ceiling. I stood there staring up at it. A gust of cool air brushed my face. It was off, so there shouldn't have been air flowing, but I felt it. Then I heard my name clear as day. Alex. I felt my knees weaken, my stomach flipped. I clenched my fists. I grabbed a chair, dragged it under the vent, and climbed up, shining my phone's flashlight inside. I saw metal walls, a few cables, and darkness. The whisper came again, right next to my ear, but I couldn't see anything. My hand shook so badly the light bounced around. That was when I felt a breeze against my face, warm this time, as though something inside the duct exhaled. I lost my nerve. I jumped down, nearly twisted my ankle, and ran out to the living room. I spent that night half awake on the couch, checking the vents every few minutes. The whispering continued off and on until sunrise. After that, I decided I had to push the condo management again. I wrote a formal complaint detailing everything. I sent emails with dates and times. I called them repeatedly until they agreed to have an overnight inspection crew come in a few days. In the meantime, I tried to cope. I stayed in the condo, but I barely slept. During the day, the place felt normal. No strange sounds, no weird feelings. But at night, it became a nightmare. As I write this down now, I'm still waiting for that overnight inspection. It's scheduled for the weekend so they can test everything in real conditions. I keep hoping there's a logical explanation, some odd mechanical glitch, a vent that echoes from another unit. But deep inside, I don't think that's the case. Every time I hear that rasping voice say my name, I feel my stomach churn and my chest tighten. It feels deliberate. It feels like something's calling out to me, moving through the ducts, room to room, following me wherever I go. I'm not sure how this will end. For now, I'm keeping every light on at night, and I'm trying to stay alert. But it's draining. Every time I hear that whisper, my heart tries to jump out of my chest. I feel sweat bead on my forehead. My legs tense up, ready to run. I can't focus on anything else. I just wait for it to stop, or for the sun to rise, whichever comes first. I hope the inspection crew finds a real, tangible cause, some faulty equipment or a hidden gap letting in outside noises. But if they don't, I might have to move again. I can't live with something calling my name through the walls. It's too much. Until they figure it out, I'm stuck here, listening to that voice echo from vent to vent, creeping closer and closer each night. I stopped in the yard when I saw my own keys hanging from the back door lock. The night air felt heavier than usual. I was tired from work, and it was after 10. I couldn't wrap my head around those keys. They were definitely mine. The little scratch on the key's head and the faded rubber ring made it clear. I stared at them for a moment, then looked around the yard to see if anyone was hiding. There was no movement or sound, just the distant hum of a neighbor's air conditioner. My pulse picked up speed. I swallowed hard and checked the rest of the area. Nothing else stood out. No footprints on the dirt patch near the fence, no dragged items or broken branches, just those keys, dangling in the lock. I tried to remember if I'd come through the back that morning. I usually lock the front door, walk to my car, and drive away. That's my routine. But the back door was shut, and there were no signs of forced entry. The handle didn't look tampered with, and the frame was intact. I stepped closer and grabbed the keys. I felt the metal between my fingers. My mind raced with questions. Did I absent-mindedly unlock this door earlier? Why would I even do that? I shook my head. I only used the front door. I was sure of that. My mouth felt dry. I rubbed my palm against my thigh. I walked around the house to the front door. It was locked. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. 10:13 p.m. I was a bit jumpy. I thought about calling someone, maybe a friend, to come over, but I didn't want to bother anyone this late. I slid the phone back into my pocket and tried to breathe normally. Then I went back to the rear entrance. The keys still felt warm in my hand from my own grip. I looked at the lock. It didn't have any scratches or chips around it. I turned the key and it opened smoothly. I stepped inside the dark kitchen. My body went on high alert. I turned on the kitchen light, half expecting to see someone crouched by the fridge or behind the counter. Nobody. The house felt quiet, almost too quiet. I listened for any creaking floors. Nothing. I placed my keys on the kitchen table, along with my wallet. The tension in my chest wouldn't let up. I could feel my heart thumping in my ears. I clenched my jaw. I took a deep breath and decided to walk through each room before settling down. I left the kitchen and turned on the hallway light. My reflection in the hallway mirror startled me. My eyes looked tired, my hair messy, my shirt wrinkled from a long day. I checked the living room. The couch was in its usual place. The TV was off. The coffee table had a few magazines. Nothing looked disturbed. I moved on to the bedroom. It was dark. I flipped the light switch. The bed was unmade, but I'd left it like that in the morning. My closet door was still closed. I opened it and ran my hand over my shirts, making sure nothing was missing. Everything seemed fine. I checked under the bed. Just some old shoes and a box of random stuff. I walked back through the hall. The door to the small laundry area was shut. I opened it and flicked on the light. My washer and dryer looked the same as always. A basket of clothes sat on top of the dryer. No one was there. I turned off the light and closed the door. I realized I was still clutching my phone. My hands felt a little clammy. I wanted some water, so I went back to the kitchen. I poured a glass and drank it in a few big gulps. My stomach was tense and my neck felt stiff. I eyed my keys on the table. Why were they in the back door lock? I know I didn't do that, at least I can't remember doing it, but who else could have done it? There was no sign of an actual break-in. My mind jumped to the possibility that someone had followed me at some point, taken my keys, and returned them. But that didn't make much sense. Why would anyone do that? I shivered. It wasn't cold, but my arms felt goosebumps. I realized I was exhausted. My eyes were heavy, but my nerves kept me awake. I decided to check the perimeter outside one more time. I stepped out into the backyard with my phone's flashlight. I moved the beam over the grass, the fence, the patio. I noticed a few old leaves along the concrete. Nothing else. I walked to the front yard, shining the light on the driveway and around my car. Everything looked normal. No suspicious footprints or dropped items. I felt uneasy, standing out there in the dark. A car passed by on the street. Its headlights swept across my lawn and then disappeared. I locked the front door behind me and went back into the kitchen to retrieve my keys. I placed them in my bedroom nightstand drawer, then double-checked the windows before getting ready for bed. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing small noises, a drip from the faucet or the wind brushing against the side of the house. My mind couldn't settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured someone creeping in my backyard, fiddling with the back door lock. I sat up in bed and rubbed my temples. The alarm clock read 3:27 a.m. I considered getting up to watch TV, but I forced myself to lie back down and wait for the morning. When daylight came, I got dressed and decided not to linger. I didn't feel safe leaving the house without some kind of action. I called a locksmith around 8 a.m. and explained the situation. The guy on the phone sounded half asleep, but he said he could come by in an hour. I made some coffee, opened my laptop in the living room, and tried to distract myself with some emails. Nothing could tear my mind away from the question: who had my keys? The locksmith arrived around 9. He was a tall guy with a shaved head and a heavy-looking toolbox. I showed him the back door. He inspected the lock, nodded, and told me he could replace it right away. While he worked, I watched the yard. I stood by the door with my arms crossed. He asked me if I had lost my keys or if someone might have borrowed them. I shook my head and said I didn't think so. He replaced the lock, tested the key a couple of times, then handed me 2 new keys. He suggested I replace the front door lock too, just in case. I agreed. I felt a bit calmer as I watched him do his job. By the time he was done, I had 4 new keys in total, 2 for the back door, 2 for the front. I thanked him, paid him, and closed the door behind him. I spent the rest of that morning wiping down the kitchen counters, vacuuming the hallway, and organizing the living room shelves. I needed to keep busy. Every few minutes, I glanced at the windows. My phone buzzed with work emails, but I didn't answer them right away. I felt on edge. My neck was still stiff. Around noon, I realized I hadn't eaten since the night before. My stomach was tight, but I made a sandwich and ate it at the kitchen table. The new keys rested next to me. I studied them like they were suspicious objects. I didn't want to put them in my regular keychain yet. I'd thrown the old set in a drawer, away from sight. In the afternoon, I sat on the couch and tried to piece things together. Had I noticed anyone strange around the office parking lot? Did I recall any coworker making a weird comment about my schedule or my house? I went through my entire workday in my head. I remembered leaving at around 8:30 p.m. I walked to my car in the garage. It was quiet, and I just drove home. I only stopped at a gas station to fill up, and I kept my keys in my jacket pocket. That's all I recalled. I didn't see any suspicious activity. I watched some TV to relax. The hours passed, and the sun went down. I stepped outside to watch the sunset from my front porch. The air was cool. I listened to the evening sounds, some traffic in the distance, a dog barking, a plane overhead. I locked the front door with my brand new key and felt a slight relief. I hoped that changing the locks would end my worry. That night I tried to sleep earlier. I kept the new keys in the nightstand again. I kept my phone next to me. I locked every window and door. I listened for noises. It was quiet. I lay in bed and forced my eyes shut. But my mind kept drifting to the back door. I pictured those keys hanging there, the metal glinting under the porch light. Who would do that? My thoughts ran in circles. I felt my heart rate climb again. I switched on the lamp and stared at the ceiling. I sat up and breathed slowly, hoping I'd calm down. After a while, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember is the alarm ringing at 6:30 a.m. I got ready for work, grabbed my new keys, and headed out the front door. I paused for a moment on the porch. I gazed around the yard, checking the gate, the bushes, and the fence line. Everything looked normal. I noticed my neighbor's car pulling out of their driveway. I lifted my hand in a small wave. They drove off without noticing me. I locked the door and walked to my car. All day at the office, I had trouble focusing. My coworkers asked if I was feeling all right. I just mumbled that I was tired. My eyes kept flicking to my coat pocket where I kept the new keys. I worried about losing them. During lunch, I sat alone in the break room. I thought about calling a friend to tell them the story, but I felt silly. Part of me wondered if I was overreacting, but the other part of me remembered how it felt to see my keys in that lock. I couldn't deny that shock. I got home earlier that evening, around 6:30 p.m. The house looked the same from the outside. I parked in the driveway, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. I used the new key and stepped inside. I flicked on the light. Everything was where I left it. I went straight to the back door. It was locked. I opened it, looked at the yard, and closed it again. Then I hung the new keys on a small hook in the kitchen next to the fridge. I wanted to make sure I had a clear routine. Every night I'd do the same thing. For the next few days, nothing unusual happened. I tried to live normally. I woke up, went to work, came home, and locked up. Still, every time I inserted the new key into the door, I felt tension in my stomach. I scanned the backyard each night, looking for footprints or random items that didn't belong. I didn't see anything. My nights were still restless, though. I woke up once or twice, convinced I'd heard a noise. I'd creep through the house with my phone's flashlight, checking corners and closets, nothing. A week later, I finally started sleeping better. I told myself that maybe I'd had a lapse in memory that day. Maybe I'd gone to the back door in a rush. But in my gut, I knew that wasn't right. I only used the front door. And I'd had the keys in my pocket at work. That part felt absolute in my mind. I never found out who had those keys or how they got them. I never discovered why someone would hang them on my back door lock and leave without taking anything or leaving any other trace. I didn't tell many people about it, and I never involved the police. There was no forced entry and nothing was stolen. I just made sure to stay alert. I replaced my locks, kept my new keys safe, and tried to move on. But sometimes late at night I still feel that same unease creep into my chest. I think about someone out there who somehow managed to borrow my keys, use them, and return them. I wonder if they still watch my house. I wonder if they ever plan to come back. I keep all my doors locked and my eyes open. The doubt is still there, deep down, and I don't know if it will ever go away. I never expected to feel uneasy in my own home. I bought this place a few years ago, tore out half the walls, and rebuilt everything from the ground up. I picked every fixture and fought with every contractor. By the end, I felt proud. It was supposed to be my personal fortress, just 4 walls, a roof, and a new garage that I could control with a button press. But then I started hearing that awful noise in the middle of the night. I remember the first time it happened. I had been living in the renovated house for a couple of months. Work was wearing me out, so I went to bed around 11. I woke up suddenly to the sound of metal scraping against metal. I checked my phone, and it was almost 3 in the morning. I thought maybe I was dreaming. I rolled over, tried to convince myself it was nothing, and went back to sleep. The next night, the same thing. A slow, grating sound around 3. I got up and walked through the hallway in the dark. My heart was pounding because something about that noise set me on edge. It came from the garage. I held my breath, opened the interior door, and flipped the light switch. The garage was empty, the door was shut, and nothing seemed wrong. I felt a wave of relief. Maybe the motor had clicked. I closed the door and went back to bed. A few nights later, I was watching TV. I didn't notice the time until my phone buzzed with some spam text. It was 2:57 a.m. I had dozed off on the couch, half awake and half asleep. I heard the same grinding noise. It sounded like the door was straining, like it wanted to move but couldn't. I hurried to the garage, expecting to catch the door in mid-motion. By the time I got there, it was still closed. I grabbed my flashlight from a shelf near the door and did a quick inspection. I checked the rails, the motor, the wiring. Everything looked normal. I tried opening the door with the remote and closing it again. No weird behavior. I shrugged it off and went back to bed, feeling unsettled but too tired to worry about it. I decided to take some action. I contacted the company that installed the motor and control system. They came out a few days later, replaced the motor, and gave me a new remote. We tested everything. The technician stayed in the garage for almost an hour, opening and closing the door repeatedly. No issues. I felt better. I even slept soundly for a week after that. Then, on a random night, the noise returned. It was around 3 in the morning again. This time I shot out of bed immediately. My pulse was racing and my hands felt sweaty. I rushed to the garage and the door was half open. I hadn't pressed a thing. The remote was on my bedside table. The motor wasn't making any sound. It looked like the door was holding itself in place. I frowned, walked up to the motor and realized it was off. There was no humming. I jiggled the wires, checked the power, and everything was intact. I closed the door using the wall switch, but it responded only after I hit the switch a couple of times. When it finally obeyed, it moved normally as if nothing was wrong. I felt a chill run through my body because I couldn't explain what I had just seen. Over the next few days, I tried different approaches. I unplugged the motor at night. I removed the backup battery. I even switched out the remote batteries just to be sure. Still, at around 3, I'd wake up and find the door open a few inches. It wasn't wide open, but just enough to let a draft slip in. I started to dread going to sleep because I knew I might hear that squeal of metal again. My stomach would twist in knots when the clock reached midnight, and I'd struggle to keep my eyes shut. I told a coworker about it. He said maybe someone was messing with me using a universal remote or some hacking device. That made sense logically, so I installed a new security camera facing the driveway. I also changed the code on the garage opener. I even checked the neighborhood forum to see if anyone else was experiencing something similar. Nobody had any stories like mine. For a while, nothing happened. Then, one night, I got home late after some drinks with a friend. I parked in the driveway, got out of the car, and noticed it was already past 2. I felt anxious. My breathing was shallow, and I had this tightness in my chest. I opened the garage door with the remote, drove inside, and closed it. I sat there in the dark, engine off, just thinking about how this door kept opening by itself. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was 2:48 a.m. I decided to stay in the car and see if something happened. I turned off all the lights, kept my hand on the door handle, and waited. Time passed slowly. My heart thumped. I felt a dull ache in my shoulders because I was so tense. I kept looking at the clock, which seemed to move at half speed. I heard the hum of the refrigerator through the wall, faint clicks from the car's cooling engine, and my own breathing. Then, at around 3, the door started to move. It began with a click, and then I heard the same scraping noise. It was slow, like someone was lifting it with their hands from the outside. I felt a jolt of fear surge through me. My skin prickled, and my fingers went numb for a second. I yanked the door handle and jumped out, expecting to see someone near the motor or messing with some wires. But there was no one. The motor was silent. The lights on the opener weren't on. The door was rising by itself, a little at a time, making that grinding sound. I grabbed the door's edge and tried to force it down. It resisted for a moment, then stopped moving altogether. When I let go, it stayed in place, halfway open. I crouched down, glanced around, and looked at the control panel on the wall. Everything was normal. I tried turning the motor on. It made a little click, but the door didn't budge. I flipped the switch again, and the door began to close like normal. I stood there, breathing hard, my heart thudding in my ears. I couldn't wrap my head around what was going on. I felt a wave of nausea, like I was going to be sick. My legs were shaky and my mouth felt dry. I went back to my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes. I felt safer in the closed space. The reality of it sank in. I wasn't pressing anything. There wasn't anybody in the garage with me. The motor was off when the door moved. I tried to calm down, but my mind kept looping through the scene. I decided to call it a night, so I walked into the house, locked the garage entry behind me, and collapsed onto my couch. I slept with all the lights on that night. From that point forward, I started avoiding coming home around 3. If I finished work late, I'd hang out at an all-night diner or drive around until after 4 in the morning. I didn't like being in the house during those hours. It felt like I was waiting for something to happen. Sometimes I'd wake up at 2 or so and feel my chest tighten because I knew what time was coming. My mouth would go dry and I'd stare at the ceiling, counting the minutes. Sometimes I heard the noise, sometimes I didn't. But I always felt that tension. I decided to test the motor in the daytime again. I pressed the remote multiple times, opened and closed the door, watched the rails, and examined the wiring. The door worked perfectly. I got up on a ladder and checked every inch of the track. Nothing was bent or loose. I inspected the motor casing, took off the cover, and looked at the circuit board. Everything seemed intact. No burnt smells, no loose wires. It all looked brand new. Despite all the checks, the problem kept happening. Friends started suggesting I move out or rent another place, but I had put so much work into this house. Plus, I didn't have the money to just pick up and leave. I felt stuck. The door opening on its own became a regular occurrence, but only around 3 in the morning. Sometimes it would open just a few inches. Other times it would open halfway. A couple of times it opened all the way, which made me panic. I once ran outside in my pajamas, convinced I'd find someone messing around in my garage. But there was nobody there. The camera footage showed the door going up, but no suspicious figures or signals. The motion sensors on the camera didn't trigger anything besides the door itself lifting. My nights turned into this tense waiting game. If I heard any creak, I'd feel my hands gripping the sheets. My forehead would start to sweat. I'd try to shut out the sound by burying my head under a pillow, but that always made me feel worse. I'd end up creeping down the hallway, flipping on every light switch, and opening the door to the garage with my heart hammering. Some nights, the door wouldn't open at all, and I'd finally drift off to sleep around 4 or 5. But a lot of times I'd hear the screech of metal. I thought about ripping out the motor entirely, but I spent good money on it, and that didn't feel like it would solve whatever was happening. I went as far as removing the entire automatic mechanism one weekend, just to see if the door would move on its own without it. I took down the chain, unplugged the motor, and unhooked everything. The door was now manual. The only way to open it was to physically lift it. For a few nights, nothing happened. I breathed easier, thinking I had finally beat the problem. Then, one night, I heard that same scraping. I ran out to the garage, flipped on the light, and saw the door shifting upward in slow increments. There was no motor attached. I had to brace it with both hands and force it closed. The feeling of raw fear washed over me. My scalp tingled, and I felt a wave of goosebumps sweep over my arms. I slammed the door shut and locked it with the manual latch. I stood there panting, staring at the locked latch. It was secure, but the door still felt like it was straining. After a second, it went still. I spent the rest of that night in my car, parked on the street. Now I avoid coming home around 3. If I'm driving back late, I'll stop at a gas station or a 24-hour grocery store. I hate being in the house during that time. I don't like hearing the door move. I don't like confronting it. Part of me wants to know why it's happening, but I also can't stand being in the middle of it. I've tested for electrical interference. I've called different specialists to check the door. Everyone says there's nothing wrong. They look at me like I'm overthinking it, but they weren't there at 3 in the morning when the door rose by itself without a motor attached. I still live here, but I've changed my habits. I spend more time at work and less time at home. I leave all the lights on in the house. I close every curtain. I keep the garage door latched by hand. Sometimes I even place a heavy bench against it. I don't hear it move as often anymore, but I can't say it's stopped entirely. Every once in a while, especially if I'm there around 3, I'll hear that faint sound, like metal dragging along the track. Each time my mouth goes dry and my heart pounds like it's going to burst. I flick on every light, open the door, and find the latch still locked. Nothing looks out of place. But I can't shake the feeling that if I stood there long enough, I'd see it start to move again. I wish I had a neat explanation. Maybe it's a mechanical quirk or some fluke in the structure I built. But no one has found a clear cause, and I'm done trying to figure it out. I know what I've seen, and I know how it makes me feel. The simplest solution has been to avoid the house at 3 in the morning. That's my life now. I don't like admitting it to people because it sounds ridiculous and makes me look paranoid, but it's real to me. I've seen that door open on its own, motor or no motor. I don't care if nobody believes me, so that's my story. My house is bright and fresh during the day, calm and ordinary in the early evening, and then it turns into something else when the clock hits the early morning hours. I still live here because it's my home, and I poured my time and money into it. But I learned to adapt. I learned to avoid that moment when the door might lift. If I come home too late, I sit in a diner, buy a coffee, and wait until it's safe to go back. I won't claim I'm okay with it, but I haven't found a better answer yet. I just know that I can't stand to witness that door rising on its own again. The memory of that scraping sound and the sight of it moving silently in the dark still sends chills through my entire body. So I stay away, and that's how I handle it. And I always run at night. I like the streets when they're empty and quiet. Most people stay inside after midnight, so it feels like I have the world to myself. One night about 6 months ago, I started noticing a weird sound near an old municipal playground. It had been shut down for years. The gates were locked with a rusty chain, and the swings were left there to rot. Every time I got close to that spot, I heard a steady squeaking sound, like a swing in motion. It made no sense because nobody was allowed in there. I remember the first time I really paid attention to it. I was jogging along the sidewalk, breathing hard, trying to keep my pace. My legs were tired from the day's work, but I pushed through because running helps me clear my head. As I approached the corner by the playground, I heard that squeak. It was slow, rhythmic, and it echoed in the night. I felt a chill on the back of my neck. My body tensed, and I glanced over at the chain-link fence surrounding the place. The park was dimly lit by a single street lamp about 30 feet away. It wasn't enough light to see inside very well, but I could make out the silhouettes of the old swings. I stopped running because I thought maybe there was someone inside, maybe a trespasser or some local hanging out, but I didn't see anyone at first. I just heard that slow metallic squeak. The fence was about shoulder height, so I tried to get on my toes and look in. My breathing was loud in my ears. My heart pounded. The squeaking didn't stop. It kept going, like something was rocking back and forth. I couldn't see what was causing it. I felt uneasy, so I decided to move on. I finished my run that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about that sound. It stayed with me even when I got home. My apartment felt colder than usual. I took a quick shower, drank some water, and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that chain-link fence and those old swings. I wondered if I had really heard something or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The following nights, I stayed on the same route. I think I was curious, even though I was nervous. As the nights passed, I kept hearing that squeak. Sometimes it was faint, other times it seemed louder, like the swing was moving faster. I could sense my adrenaline spike every time I neared the park. My fingertips tingled and my stomach felt tight. I told myself it was just some random wind pattern or maybe the rusted chains responding to a breeze. But I knew there was something else going on. About 2 weeks later, I decided to get a closer look. It was almost midnight and the streets were empty. A stray cat ran across the sidewalk ahead of me, and I remember the sound of my shoes scuffing the pavement. My lungs burned a bit because I had pushed my pace earlier in the run. When I turned the corner, that squeaking noise was there again. Slow, deliberate. It felt deliberate anyway. I walked up to the fence, gripped the metal links, and peered into the darkness. The moonlight helped a bit, and I saw one of the swings moving. It wasn't the wind. There was no gust blowing. The air was pretty still that night. But the swing was in motion, swaying back and forth. My eyes strained to see who was sitting there. I saw a shape in the seat, like a person leaning forward slightly. I couldn't see a face. I froze. My pulse pounded in my ears. My muscles tightened, and I felt a trembling in my legs. I wanted to call out, but my throat felt dry. I swallowed hard and said, "Hey." Right when I spoke, the squeaking stopped. The swing became still. I tried to see if the shape was still there, but it seemed like it vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. My heart was hammering, and I felt a bead of sweat run down my forehead. I stared at that swing for what felt like a full minute. It didn't move again. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was just exhausted or seeing shadows. My breathing was shallow, so I took a few deep breaths to calm down. Then I backed away from the fence, trying not to make noise. The streetlight flickered overhead. For a second, I imagined someone standing right behind me, but when I spun around, there was no one. I laughed a little, but it was a nervous laugh. Then I started running again, faster than usual, all the way home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, replaying the moment in my head. I kept seeing that shape. It looked small, but I couldn't be sure of its exact size. The idea of someone or something inside that locked playground disturbed me. I tried to brush it off as a trick of the light, but I couldn't fully believe it. The next day, I walked past the playground during daylight. It was quiet. The rusty swings hung there, perfectly still. The fence was intact. There were no signs of anyone sneaking in. Everything looked normal. I went back that night, though. I felt compelled to do it. I started my usual run around 11 and reached the playground around midnight. I slowed to a walk and listened. My ears picked up every little sound. The hum of distant traffic, a dog barking a couple of blocks away, my own footsteps on the sidewalk. Then I heard that squeaking again. My chest tightened. I stepped closer to the fence, trying to keep my breathing under control. I saw the same swing moving, and I saw that shape again. It looked like a person sitting there, but I couldn't make out any details. My palms were sweaty, and my hands shook a bit as I gripped the fence. I tried to call out again, but my voice cracked. "Is anyone there?" I managed to say. The squeaking went on for a few more seconds. and then it stopped. I squinted, hoping to catch a better glimpse, but the figure vanished again. I'm not talking about running away. It just wasn't there anymore. The swing rocked a little, then came to a halt. My stomach churned. I felt a slight nausea, like the world was off balance. I ended my run early that night. I wasn't in the mood for more exercise. I went home, locked the door, and sat in my living room with the lights on. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was a trick of the shadows, or maybe someone was sneaking in and out quickly. But the gate was locked. The fence was solid, at least 5 feet tall. I couldn't figure out how anyone could get out of there so fast without me seeing. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with that place. My runs turned into cautious scouting missions. I would slow down before I even reached the park. Some nights, the swing was completely still and silent. Other nights, I heard it squeaking before I even saw the fence. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow, a blur near the fence. My heart would race and sweat would form on my brow. My body felt tense the whole time. It got to a point where I almost dreaded running at all, but I couldn't stop. Something about that park pulled me in. One night I decided to bring a flashlight. I tucked it into the pocket of my shorts and headed out on my run around 11:30. When I got to the park, it was quiet. I listened for the squeaking, but it didn't come. I waited, standing across the street from the fence. I counted my breaths. I heard a car in the distance, maybe half a mile away. I heard insects buzzing around the street lamp. Then, just as I started to think it wasn't going to happen, the swing started squeaking. My skin prickled. I pulled the flashlight out, clicked it on, and aimed the beam through the fence. The swing was moving, but I didn't see anyone in it. It was just rocking back and forth. The chains groaned, the seat twisted slightly. It looked worn and cracked. My flashlight beam shook because my hand was trembling. I started stepping closer. Each step felt heavier than the last. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I reached the fence, aimed the light directly at the swing, and saw it sway like someone had just pushed off from it. But there was no one around. I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight. I lifted my other hand to the fence, gripping it for support. The metal links felt cold against my skin. I stared at the swing until it slowed down and stopped. The chains went quiet. My arms felt numb. I stood there for a while, waiting to see if anything else would happen. Nothing did. Finally, I turned off the flashlight, slipped it back into my pocket, and started to walk away. I got maybe 10 steps when the squeaking started again. I spun around, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it. The swing was moving again like it had never stopped. I backed away quickly, my heart pounding. I almost tripped over a crack in the sidewalk. I ran straight home. My lungs burned by the time I reached my door. Once inside, I locked the deadbolt and leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My legs felt weak. My shirt was soaked with sweat. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing that squeak in my head, and each time I thought about it, my chest tightened. Over the next few days, I considered calling the city or maybe the police to check it out, but I knew how that would sound. There's a locked-up playground with a haunted swing that moves by itself. Nobody would take that seriously. They'd say it was the wind or maybe the fence vibrations. I started thinking I was losing my mind. I even stopped running for a week just to clear my head. But that left me restless. Eventually, I decided to confront it again. I didn't want to live with that tension. I went back one night, around the same time, midnight. I walked up to the fence and waited. At first, nothing happened. I paced back and forth, listening to my own footsteps on the sidewalk. The street lamp overhead buzzed. I could smell the damp air. It had rained earlier, and puddles shimmered under the light. After several minutes, the swing started to squeak again. That sound made the hair on my arms stand up. I grabbed the fence and shook it, testing its strength. It held firm. The gate was padlocked. I felt a sudden urge to jump over it. I knew I shouldn't do that because it's trespassing, but I had to see what was going on. My breathing grew shallow. I put my foot on one of the fence rails and pulled myself up. My foot slipped once, but I gripped the links until my palms hurt. I managed to climb over and drop down on the other side. My knees bent to absorb the impact and the gravel crunched under my shoes. I stood inside that deserted playground, flashlight in hand. The squeaking got louder. The swing moved like someone was really pushing it. I approached slowly, my flashlight pointed straight at it. My stomach felt tight, and I was ready to bolt if something happened. When I got closer, I saw the seat tilt as though someone had just gotten off, but there was nobody there. I felt a rush of cold air pass by me. My arms broke out in goosebumps. I turned around, shining the beam in every direction, but I saw nothing unusual. Just rusted playground equipment, cracked pavement, and a few overgrown bushes in the corners. I reached out and touched the swing seat. It was damp and cold, and it was definitely moving. I didn't see any fishing line or trick mechanism. I stood there, shining the light around, trying to spot some intruder. Nothing. After a few moments, the swing slowed. My breathing was rapid and my temples pounded. I felt this intense feeling that I wasn't alone, but I couldn't see anyone. I stayed there for about 10 more minutes, circling the playground, shining my flashlight on everything I could. I saw broken benches, a couple of trash cans knocked over, and an old slide with chipped paint. It was all silent except for that squeaking swing which would randomly start and stop. I felt like someone was watching me, but I couldn't pinpoint where that feeling came from. My body was stiff with tension. I decided I'd had enough. I walked back to the fence, climbed over, and walked home. I didn't run. My legs felt like lead, and my thoughts were jumbled. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and stood in my living room just breathing, listening to my own heartbeat. I didn't sleep much that night either. Now, I still run, but I avoid that street. If I ever have to pass by there, I do it during the day. The playground is still locked and the swings are still there. I can't explain what's happening in that place. I just know it feels wrong. I feel uneasy even thinking about it. I haven't told many people. The few times I mentioned it, I got strange looks. So I keep it to myself. It's one of those things I can't make sense of, and I don't want to push my luck anymore. I have no idea what I saw, but I know I saw something, and I'd rather not see it again. I never used to feel uncomfortable in my own house. I never thought I'd glance over my shoulder in my own basement, worried about what might be hidden in the dark. That changed a few weeks ago. Now I can't ignore what I see out of the corner of my eye down there. Every time I step into that musty space, I feel an immediate drop in my stomach, like my body's bracing for something. I'm not a superstitious guy, but I can't shake this feeling that someone's crouched behind those stacked boxes watching me. My basement is part storage area, part workshop. When I first moved in, I set up a long wooden table on one side for small projects. I keep a toolbox, a few power tools, and random pieces of scrap wood there. I also put up metal shelves along one wall, where I've been stacking old boxes, paint cans, and leftover materials from various home repairs. The lighting is dim because there's only one overhead bulb that sometimes flickers. It never bothered me before. I just thought it was an old house quirk. But now, that flicker sets me on edge. I started noticing something off about a month ago. It was late at night, maybe around 1 a.m., and I realized I needed a specific wrench for a project I was doing upstairs. I went down to the basement and turned on the single light. The bulb gave off that faint hum that old bulbs sometimes do, and the corners were mostly in shadow. I walked to the workbench, rummaging through my tools. That's when I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. I turned my head slightly and saw something that made my stomach twist. It looked like a person hunched down near the shelves in the far corner. I didn't see details. It was just a shape, low to the ground, almost like someone squatting. My heart jumped and I turned fully to face it. But all I saw were boxes stacked on each other. I stood there for a moment, my pulse pounding. I wiped my hands on my jeans and took a slow breath. I told myself the boxes must have looked like a figure because of the way they were arranged. I shook my head, grabbed the wrench, and hurried back upstairs. I didn't tell anyone about it. It was late, and I felt silly. I chalked it up to lack of sleep. Over the next few days, I avoided going down to the basement at night. I didn't even notice I was doing it at first. I just found ways to get what I needed before it got dark. But 2 weeks later, I was up late again, fixing a pipe under the kitchen sink. I needed pipe tape, which I knew was on my workbench. It was around midnight. I hesitated for a second at the top of the basement stairs. I flipped on the basement light before going down, hoping that would help. I kept my eyes on the wooden steps as I descended, trying not to think about that corner. The air felt heavy. My shoulders tensed up, and I realized I was gripping the railing a little too hard. I walked over to the bench and scanned around. Tools were scattered, and I couldn't see the roll of tape right away. I was shifting things around, eyes darting everywhere. In my peripheral vision, I saw that shape again. My breath caught in my throat, and my grip tightened on a hammer I'd just picked up. It felt like something was there, watching. My arm hairs stood on end. I heard a faint shuffle. My heartbeat spiked, and I spun toward the corner with the shelves, lifting the hammer a bit. Nothing moved. I saw boxes, an old lamp, a bag of cement mix. But I couldn't ignore the sensation of eyes on me. My throat felt dry, and my chest felt tight. I inched closer to the corner, forcing myself to check it out. I moved aside a couple of boxes, but all I found was more dusty junk. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it in my ears. I muttered to myself that I was being paranoid. Then I heard something like a short, quick breath from behind me, and I whipped around. There was no one there, but that rush of fear hit me again, and I could barely swallow. I grabbed my pipe tape from the bench, hurried up the stairs, and locked the basement door. I spent the rest of the night trying to focus on the pipe fix, but my mind kept flashing back to that corner. The memory gave me goosebumps, like I wasn't alone down there. After that, I started checking the basement during the day. I'd go down, open all the windows, and turn on a big standing lamp I have for better visibility. I reorganized some of the shelves, stacking the boxes differently. I thought if I changed the layout, I wouldn't see that shape anymore. It worked for a day or two. I felt better, like I had some control over my space. But soon enough, I caught a glimpse of it again. This time, it was afternoon, and the windows let in some weak daylight. I leaned down under the workbench to pick up a dropped screwdriver, and I had that same prickle on the back of my neck. I looked up, and there it was, a crouched silhouette in the corner. My chest seized, and I stood up so fast I banged my head on the bench. When I turned around, I only saw the new arrangement of boxes. Nothing else. My head throbbed from the impact, and my eyes started tearing up a bit. I cursed under my breath and told myself I was imagining things, but my skin crawled all the same. I've tried explaining it to a buddy of mine who's into horror movies. He just laughed and told me it was probably stress or exhaustion. I wanted to believe him, but after the next incident, I couldn't brush it off so easily. 3 nights ago, I had to finish assembling a piece of furniture for the living room. I needed a power drill and some screws. It was late, around 11:30 p.m., but I just wanted to get it done. I remember standing at the top of the basement steps, feeling this tightness in my chest. My palms were sweating. I flicked the light switch, and that small overhead bulb flickered again. I took the steps slowly, one by one, scanning the basement as I descended. Everything felt oppressive, like the air was too thick. I walked to the workbench, found my drill, and started searching for the screws. My eyes kept moving toward that corner even when I tried to focus on the drawer in front of me. Every time my glance shifted, I expected to see someone squatting there, waiting. My breathing got shaky, and I told myself to hurry. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made my entire body stiffen. It was like someone inhaling hard. The sound came from the corner. It was close. I could almost feel the breath on my neck. My heart rate spiked so fast I thought I might faint. I whipped around with the drill in my hand, acting on pure adrenaline. My voice came out in a shaky burst. I yelled, "Who's there?" My words echoed in the basement. There was no answer. I walked backward toward the stairs, keeping my eyes on that corner. It felt like my legs were made of lead, and my chest was pounding so hard I could barely think. I could still sense someone watching. My skin broke out in a cold sweat. I grabbed the railing behind me and forced myself to move up the steps without turning away from that spot. As soon as I reached the top, I slammed the door and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly that I had trouble fitting the key into the lock for a moment. Once upstairs, I put the drill and screws down on the kitchen table. I stared at my hands, noticing how clammy they were. My breathing was shallow, and I couldn't calm down right away. I stood there, heart thudding, trying to gather myself. After a minute, I forced myself to return to my project in the living room. But the whole time I felt uneasy, like the basement door behind me was more than just a door. My mind kept replaying that sharp inhale I heard, as if it were right next to my ear. My shoulders stayed tense until I finally went to bed, and even then, I couldn't sleep well. Now I do my best to avoid the basement at night. If I need something from down there after dark, I try to push it to the next morning, but I can't always do that. Like last night, I realized I needed some nails. I tried to put it off. I went to bed around 10 p.m., but I couldn't sleep because I kept remembering the undone work in the garage. I was restless, tossing in bed, feeling irritated with myself for letting this fear control me. I finally got up at midnight, telling myself I'd grab the nails real fast, no messing around. I told myself, you're just gonna walk in, grab the nails, walk out. Simple. I turned on every light in the path to the basement, the hallway, the kitchen, and the overhead in the staircase. I even turned on the flashlight on my phone and held it tight in my free hand. I opened the basement door, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the first stair. I felt that same tension in my shoulders. The basement light was still flickering, but I tried to ignore it. One step at a time, I got to the bottom. I immediately aimed my phone's flashlight around, sweeping the corners. Nothing unusual, just the boxes, shelves, and tools. I moved quickly to the shelf where I keep extra nails. My footsteps sounded loud on the concrete floor. I searched for the box of nails while keeping my phone's beam pointed toward that corner. My heart pounded in my ears. The air smelled stale and damp. My breath felt too warm in my chest. My hands shook a bit as I sifted through a few small boxes. I pulled out the nails I needed, slid them into my pocket, and turned to leave. That's when I heard a different noise. It wasn't a breath this time. It sounded like a soft scrape against the floor, like a shoe sliding for just a second. My scalp tingled, and the hair on my arms stood up. The noise came from directly behind the stacked boxes in that corner. I aimed my flashlight. At first I saw nothing but the edges of the boxes and a paint can. Then, for a fraction of a second, I swore I saw movement, like something shifting its position. My mouth went dry. I didn't wait. I sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. I didn't stop until I was in the kitchen with the door shut behind me. My chest heaved and I felt a knot in my stomach. I stood there panting, nails in my pocket, and a phone flashlight still on in my hand. I couldn't believe how rattled I was. I wanted to run outside and sit in my car, but that felt ridiculous. Instead, I walked around the kitchen, turning lights on and off, trying to calm down. I forced myself to drink some water. My throat was parched and my fingers trembled when I set the glass down on the countertop. I've started thinking about ways to handle this. I'm not calling the cops because there's no sign of an actual intruder, no forced entry, no footprints, nothing stolen. There's just that horrible feeling of being watched and the occasional sounds. But I can't ignore what I've seen. I've checked that basement a dozen times in daylight, moving every box, every old blanket, every leftover tile. I never find evidence of someone living down there. I've inspected the windows to make sure they're locked. I've checked all the corners behind the furnace and the water heater. It's always empty. Yet at night, something feels different. The shadows seem too dense, and that flickering bulb casts strange shapes on the walls. I've thought about installing better lighting, maybe overhead fluorescents or strong LED strips. That might help me feel more in control. But part of me worries I'll still see that crouched shape even in bright light. The idea of shining a bright beam right onto an actual figure makes my stomach lurch. What if there really is someone hiding, but there's nowhere for them to go without me noticing? unless they're crawling behind the shelves somehow, which seems impossible. I don't feel safe in my own basement. It's embarrassing to admit. I'm a grown man, and I'm afraid of some shape in the corner. But it's not just the sight. It's the sounds, too. That short inhale I heard was way too real. My body's reaction was instant, like my instincts recognized a threat. That's what keeps me up at night. Every noise the house makes after midnight puts me on alert. The refrigerator clicks off, and I jump. A floorboard creaks upstairs and my heart rate climbs. I feel like I'm losing my grip on what's normal. I haven't told many people about this. My buddy still thinks it's all in my head, but he hasn't stood in that basement, feeling the air change and hearing someone breathe right behind him. He hasn't fumbled for the light switch with sweat dripping down his face, convinced he's seconds away from seeing something that shouldn't be there. I have no proof to show anybody. No footprints, no recordings, no sightings beyond that silhouette. But I know something's there, or at least something feels there. The tension in my body doesn't lie. For now, I'm careful about when I go downstairs. I only go if it's absolutely necessary, and I always keep my phone's flashlight on, even in the daytime. I've considered setting up a camera, but part of me doesn't want to see what might appear on the footage. I feel trapped between wanting answers and wanting to pretend this is all in my imagination. But every time I step into that basement, that shape appears at the edge of my vision, crouched down, observing me in silence. I don't know if this will ever escalate or if it'll just keep haunting the corner of my eye. There's a chance it's a trick of the light or some weird illusion caused by the piles of boxes. The breathing might be the old furnace or my own heavy breathing echoing. I can't prove otherwise. But as things stand right now, I can't shake the dread I feel whenever I set foot on those steps. My body reacts before my mind can rationalize. My chest tightens, my jaw clenches, and I get ready to bolt. So I do my best to finish my tasks fast, get what I need, and go back upstairs. At least nothing has actually attacked me. I tell myself that every time. Whatever it is, or whatever I'm imagining, it hasn't laid a hand on me. But I can't control the alarm bells going off in my head when I hear that scraping sound or a quiet exhale behind me. I can't stop my heart from racing when I see that shape out of the corner of my eye and feel my neck hairs rising. It's constant. It's real enough to keep me from feeling safe in my own home at night. That's all there is to my story for now. I'm living with this strange presence in my basement, avoiding late-night visits, double-checking the locks and wondering if it's just a pile of boxes or something else entirely. I can't give a neat conclusion or a satisfying resolution. I can only say that I still see that crouched silhouette and I still hear those breaths in the darkness. That's why I don't like going down there after midnight, and that's why I keep a hammer close by every time I do. I'll never forget the first time I saw the clock hit 3:17 and heard that damn alarm go off. It was pitch black in my bedroom. I remember jolting awake, my eyes stinging, and my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The sensor in the hallway started its shrill beeping, and all I could think was that someone had broken in. I leaped out of bed, my feet tangled in the sheets, and practically crashed into the bedside table. My shin still hurt by the time I made it to the hallway light switch. I flicked the switch on, and my eyes struggled with the sudden brightness. The sensor's little red LED was blinking. I saw the reflection of that tiny light on the walls. I took a few deep breaths, swallowing hard, and crept down the hallway, my socks sliding a bit on the wooden floor. My throat felt dry, and I realized I wasn't sure if I could even shout if I saw someone in front of me, but I forced myself to call out anyway. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence. Nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I checked the front door, locked from the inside. I checked the windows in the living room, all closed, no sign of forced entry. I felt the back of my neck tingling. My entire body felt tense. My arms felt heavy, and my stomach was turning. I opened the closet, the bathroom door, even looked under the dining table. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. I ended up turning off the sensor alarm, thinking maybe it was a faulty battery. It took me a while to get back to sleep because my heart wouldn't slow down. When I finally did sleep, my dreams were full of weird shapes moving through dark hallways. But the next morning, I tried to push it away. Maybe the sensor glitched or some shadow set it off. That was the first time. But then it happened again the next night. Right at 3:17 in the morning, that same shrill alarm pierced the silence. This time, I jumped out of bed so fast I felt a small pop in my knee. I grabbed the baseball bat from beside my bed, one I usually kept there for peace of mind, and rushed into the hallway. I wasn't even fully awake, but adrenaline was pumping. My mouth was dry again, and I could feel sweat forming on my forehead. When I got to the corridor, the sensor was blinking like before, the alarm still going off, but no one was there. I walked around, checking every corner, feeling a slight chill in the air. I looked up at the ceiling. I checked around the corners of each doorway, the small space between the fridge and the wall. Nothing. I turned the alarm off, stared at that sensor, and felt a surge of frustration and confusion. Why exactly 3:17? I looked at my phone just to be sure. It was 3:17 on the dot. Over the following week, it kept happening. Every single time, 3:17 a.m. I started anticipating it. I'd wake up at 3:15, glance at the clock, and lie there waiting. Right on cue, 3:17 would roll around and the alarm would scream. I'd jump up, run out, and find nothing. No broken windows, no footsteps in the living room, no scuff marks on the walls, no open doors. I even started checking for tiny holes or loose wires that might trip the sensor. Didn't see anything odd. I decided to change the sensor. I bought a new model with a higher sensitivity range. I also changed the batteries, the mounting angle, and even got a second sensor for the same hallway. I placed them both at different heights. If it was an animal, or maybe a breeze from somewhere, I wanted to catch some sign of it. But it kept happening, and it always stayed the same. 3:17 a.m., beep, 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 me flying out of bed, scanning the hallway, no sign of anything. I tried ignoring the alarm for one night just to see what would happen. I lay there in bed with my eyes open, listening to the beeping. My heart was racing and I was sweating through my shirt. After about 30 seconds of the alarm, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go check. My instincts wouldn't let me stay put. The corridor was empty, just like every other night. The alarm wouldn't stop until I switched it off. I felt like the house was taunting me. My day-to-day life started feeling weird. I'd go to work groggy and jumpy. My boss noticed. He asked if everything was okay. I mumbled something about rough nights, but I didn't want to get into details because it sounded ridiculous. Yeah, my sensor alarm is going off at exactly 3:17 a.m. every night for no reason. People would think I was exaggerating or losing my mind, but I knew it was happening and it was messing me up. I tried moving the sensor to different parts of the corridor, thinking maybe there was a warm pipe behind a wall or some draft from outside. It made no difference. Then I installed a smart camera with a motion sensor. I linked it to my phone, hoping to get actual footage of whatever was going on. I tested it during the day, walked in front of it, triggered it, and it recorded me just fine. I felt a small rush of hope. Finally, I'll catch something in the act, I thought. That first night with the camera set up, I woke up at 3:16, stared at the clock, and waited. At 3:17, the sensor beeped. I was half expecting it, but I still jolted a bit. My heart jumped and I felt a drip of sweat roll down the side of my face. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and opened the camera app. It showed that motion had been detected and recorded. I felt an immediate spike of adrenaline. I rushed to open the playback. The footage showed the timestamp 3:17. The hallway light was off, so it was in night vision mode. I saw the corridor, slightly grainy and gray. For a moment, the camera just showed static shapes of furniture and walls, and then the video ended. I rewound it twice, watching carefully. There was no movement on screen, no shadow, no figure, no shape. The sensor picked up motion, but the camera showed nothing moving. I felt a chill run up my arms. I had goosebumps. I couldn't explain it. After a few nights of the same pattern, sensor goes off, camera records motion, but shows an empty corridor. I started feeling paranoid. I was sleeping maybe 3 or 4 hours a night. I was becoming snappy with coworkers, and I jumped at little noises in the office. One afternoon, I went home early and stood in the corridor with the sensors. I watched the clock, tested the sensors, and walked back and forth checking for any anomalies. I considered the possibility of some electrical interference, but I didn't have any large devices in that area. The wiring in the house seemed normal. Eventually, I decided to stay up until 3:17 to see what would happen if I was already in the hallway when the time came. I brewed coffee around midnight, sat on the sofa in my living room, and put my phone next to me with the camera app open. The corridor was dark, but I could see the tiny sensor lights from where I sat. Time crawled. I kept checking my phone's clock. 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 2:45 a.m. My legs felt restless. My mind started wandering, but every time I caught myself drifting, I'd snap back to the moment. By 3:10, my heart was already thumping. The house was silent. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional crack of the building settling, and my own breathing. When 3:17 hit, I leaned forward on the sofa. My shoulders were tense and I was clenching my jaw. Then the alarm went off. The sensor beeped. I jumped up so fast that I nearly tripped over the coffee table. I forced myself to walk quickly but carefully into the hallway. The alarm was blaring and the lights from the sensors were blinking. I looked around. The hallway was empty. I squinted, trying to see if any shape or outline was there. Nothing. I stood there, letting the alarm go, looking in every direction. I felt a rush of cold sweat on my back. The alarm's sound cut straight through me, and my ears felt hot. I turned it off, took a deep breath, and checked my phone camera. It had recorded again, and again it showed nothing. I started feeling a mixture of anger and fear. Part of me wanted to rip the sensors off the walls and throw them in the trash. But that wouldn't solve anything because deep down, I knew something was setting them off. Something was crossing that hallway, I just couldn't see it. I spoke to a friend who was into electronics, and he suggested maybe dust particles or even a large insect. But dust wouldn't trigger a motion sensor so consistently at the exact same time. An insect might, but it would show up on the camera's night vision, at least as a small blur, and I'd probably see it flying around or crawling somewhere else. This wasn't adding up. I decided to try a different approach. I placed talcum powder on the floor in the hallway. I sprinkled a light layer across the length of the corridor, near the baseboards, and right under the sensor. If something or someone was moving through there, maybe I'd see footprints. That night, the alarm went off as always. I walked out, checked the powder, and saw no prints. Not even a smear. The floor was still perfectly smooth with white powder. My nerves were shot. I wiped my sweaty palms on my shorts and felt that same shaky frustration. Nothing was there, but the sensor said otherwise. Night after night, I kept confronting that alarm. My routine became a desperate cycle. Fall asleep late, jolt awake at 3:17, investigate, find nothing, try to go back to sleep. Each time I felt more exhausted. I started skipping meals. My appetite was gone, replaced by a constant ball of tension in my gut. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at the clock in the living room, waiting for time to pass, dreading the moment I'd have to face that beep again. I tried leaving all the lights on in the hallway once. I thought maybe the sensor was more sensitive in the dark. Didn't matter. It still went off at 3:17. Bright lights, dim lights, no lights. It made no difference. I replaced the batteries, swapped sensors, rearranged them, and nothing changed. The strangest part was the clock accuracy. It wasn't 3:16 or 3:18. It was never 3:15 or 3:19, always 3:17. I checked my phone's clock against a computer and against the microwave clock. They all matched. The logs from the alarm system also showed the same thing, 3:17 exactly every single night. By this point, I was fed up. My nerves were frayed, and I felt a constant ache in my head. I thought about calling some kind of specialist, or maybe even sleeping at a friend's place to see if the situation would repeat without me there. But I didn't want to abandon my own house, and I had no explanation. It's not like I was hearing footsteps or voices. I wasn't seeing shadowy figures or flickering lights. The only tangible evidence was the motion sensor being triggered. I started talking to neighbors, asking if they had experienced anything like power surges or weird timing issues with electronics. One neighbor mentioned that sometimes around 3 a.m. he heard a loud truck passing by. But that didn't explain the perfect timing or why my indoor sensors were picking something up. Another neighbor suggested maybe it was a cat outside. But we're talking about an indoor hallway in a locked house with all windows shut. It didn't make sense. After enough nights of this, I decided to block off the hallway entirely. I closed the doors on both ends, locked them, and wedged chairs against them. There was no way for anything to cross that space without me hearing the doors open or the chairs scrape the floor. That night, I stayed on the living room side. Sure enough, 317 rolled around, and the sensor beeped again. The chairs were exactly where I left them. Neither door had been opened. I felt my stomach twist. There was simply no explanation. I kept notes on everything: dates, times, minor observations. I noticed I would sometimes feel a slight change in temperature around 3 a.m., but I was never sure if it was just me or an actual drop in the house. I installed a basic thermostat in the hallway to see if there was a pattern. Sometimes it read a normal temperature. Sometimes it was a degree or two lower, but not enough to be definitive. Still, that alarm never failed. 317. Beep, beep, beep. One night, I tried turning off all the circuit breakers to see if maybe the electricity was causing some glitch. I shut everything down except for one breaker that powered the sensor. The house was otherwise dark and silent. The alarm still triggered at 317. I stood there in the blackness, feeling sweat build under my arms, and turned off the alarm with shaky hands. Then I went to the panel and turned the breakers back on. I felt drained and unsettled. I started sleeping in the living room so I could be closer to the hallway. I'd lie there on the couch, fully dressed, with a flashlight on the coffee table. Some nights I'd turn the TV on with low volume to distract myself. The tension would build as the clock approached 317. My chest felt tight and my neck muscles were stiff. Once it hit that minute, I'd stand up waiting. The alarm would beep, I'd walk into the hallway and find nothing. After weeks of this, I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I told 2 friends and asked them to stay over one weekend. I just wanted someone else to witness it. They arrived on a Friday night, both of them carrying overnight bags. They joked about bringing ghost hunting gear, but I didn't laugh. We set up an air mattress in the living room and I explained the routine. I warned them it would happen at 317. They were skeptical but curious. We all sat there talking, playing cards, occasionally glancing at our phones for the time. I could feel my nerves spiking as it got closer to 3 in the morning. My legs were bouncing and I couldn't focus on the conversation. When 317 hit, the alarm blasted through the quiet. My friends jumped. One of them almost fell off the sofa in surprise. We all scrambled to the hallway. Once again, the sensor was going off, the lights were blinking, and no one was there. We checked everything for about 10 minutes. Nothing was out of place. Doors and windows were still locked. My friends looked uneasy. They weren't laughing anymore. The next night, the same exact thing happened right at 317. We watched the camera footage together. It showed the timestamp, the motion detection overlay, but an empty corridor. One friend rubbed his arms as if he was cold. The other kept shaking his head, whispering, "This is insane." They left on Sunday morning, and I noticed they didn't joke about it when they said goodbye. So here I am. It's been like this for too long. I'm still going through it almost every single night. If I ever sleep through it, I wake up to find the log showing 317, motion detected. It never misses. I have no clue what's causing it. I've done every check I can think of. I've replaced sensors, repositioned them, changed the batteries, installed cameras, sprinkled powder, blocked the hallway. Nothing helps. The sensor goes off. I find nothing. and I'm left with that tight feeling in my chest and a lump in my throat. I'm not sure what else to do. I just stand there in that hallway, eyes darting around, searching for an explanation. The clock says 3:17. The alarm blares, and each time I'm left with no answers, just an empty space and a nagging sense that something, somewhere, is crossing my hallway at the exact same minute every night, and I can't see it. I don't know if I ever will. All I know is the alarm never lies, and neither does the clock. 3:17, every night, and so far it hasn't stopped. I got home last month feeling tired but glad to be back. I walked into my living room and saw something that made my stomach flip. Several of the picture frames on my wall were turned upside down. One of them was flipped so far around that the back was facing outward. I keep these photos organized at the same height, perfectly aligned in a neat row. I hate when anything looks messy or out of order. I looked around trying to see if there was any sign of a break-in, but everything else seemed normal. My front door was still locked. The windows were shut. My furniture was untouched. Nothing else appeared out of place. It was the frames. It was just the frames. I grabbed one of them, a photo from a trip to California a few years back, and checked the frame for damage. It wasn't broken. The glass was intact. The hooks on the back were still tight. Whoever messed with it was careful. I felt my heart pounding. I stared at the wedding photo of my grandparents. That was the one that disturbed me the most. It was turned completely backward, exposing that plain cardboard backing. I've always kept that particular photo in a nice brass frame in the center of the display. Now it looked like some kind of message. I put it back in its normal position, trying to ignore the prickle on the back of my neck. I told myself that maybe I had bumped into the frames by accident, but I knew I hadn't. I had been out of town the entire weekend, visiting my mother in the countryside. I locked up carefully before I left. I always double-check. I can't stand leaving anything open or unsecured, especially with my job. I'm an IT manager in a small company, and I work with data security all the time. I'm used to checking details. That night, I walked through every room, turning lights on and off, looking for any sign of forced entry. The locks looked fine. There were no scratches on the windows. I felt a chill in the living room, like the air was still, but I chalked it up to my own tension. I ended up going to bed late, but I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about those frames. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, feeling restless. I went back to the living room and looked at the frames again. They were still in the proper position, so at least nothing had changed overnight. I decided not to think too much about it. I had work to do. I had a few meetings and a bunch of emails waiting. My plan was to let it go. But 3 weeks later, I visited my mother again. She lives about 4 hours away. She's healthy, but sometimes she needs help with errands, and I like to be there for her. I stayed the entire weekend. When I came back on Sunday afternoon, the frames were rearranged again. Not all of them, just some. This time, the wedding photo of my grandparents was upside down, near the edge of the shelf where I keep my travel souvenirs. 2 other family photos were also flipped. They were both from my father's side of the family. Again, I saw no sign of a break-in. My front door was still locked, with no tampering around the latch. The windows were secure. It felt wrong. I felt this tightness in my chest. It was like someone was singling out those pictures on purpose. I tried to calm myself by going through the house methodically. I opened all the closets. I checked under my bed. I looked inside the crawl space. I found nothing. No footprints, no disturbed dust, no missing objects. The only change was in those frames. Once again, I turned them back to their normal positions. My palms were damp. My breathing felt shallow. I was anxious but also irritated. It felt like an invasion of my privacy. I stood there in my living room with the lights on, scanning every corner. That night, I sat in my favorite armchair with the TV on, but I couldn't focus on any show. I kept glancing at the frames. It's a habit of mine to keep things neat. I grew up that way. My father was in the military, and everything in our house was always organized and labeled. Those frames had never been out of order before. I felt sweat on my forehead even though it wasn't hot. My mind kept racing through possibilities. Could a friend have a spare key? Did someone find a way to pick the lock? I thought about calling the police, but there was no proof of a crime. Nothing was stolen or damaged besides the frames being moved around. A couple of days passed. I tried to go about my life. I worked from home sometimes, and whenever I walked into the living room, I double-checked the frames. They stayed in place for the rest of that week. I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was forgetting to lock up properly. But I knew I was careful. I always check twice before I leave. Then, one Friday night, I decided to set up a small camera in the living room. I had an old webcam in my office drawer. I figured I could record while I was gone for the weekend. If anyone or anything came into the living room, I'd catch it on video. So I put the webcam on top of a bookshelf, angled it toward the wall with the photos, and ran the cable to my laptop. I tested it for a while. The picture was decent, not the best quality, but it should have been enough to see if someone came inside. That weekend, I went to see my mother again. She was fine, just needed me to help install a new washing machine. We spent Saturday afternoon working on it. I tried not to think about my living room or those frames. On Sunday morning, I drove back. As soon as I entered my house, I felt a rush of nervous energy. The living room looked normal at first glance, but when I walked closer to the wall, I saw that same wedding photo turned upside down again. It was the only one out of place this time. The rest were aligned as I had left them. My shoulders felt tense, and I hurried toward my office to check the webcam footage. I sat down at my desk and opened the video file. I fast-forwarded through hours of an empty living room. I didn't see any movement. The frames looked still. No shadows, no flickers, nothing. Then, at some point early Sunday morning, the video froze for about 10 seconds. When it resumed, the frame was flipped. There was no one on camera. There was no sign of a hand or a figure. It was just changed. I checked the software settings to see if it might have glitched. Everything seemed fine. My hands were shaking as I scrolled back and forth in the footage. The camera didn't capture any intruder. I muttered curses under my breath. This felt impossible. I shut my laptop, stood up, and walked around the house, looking behind doors and inside cabinets again. Nothing. I tried to tell myself there had to be a logical explanation, but I couldn't find one. My head started throbbing, and I realized I hadn't eaten anything since the morning. I made a quick sandwich and returned to the living room. I took the wedding photo off the wall, unhooked the back, and checked inside. The photo was still the same. It's a black and white shot of my grandparents on their wedding day, both smiling, standing in front of a small church. The date was scribbled on the back in old handwriting. I ran my finger along the edge of the frame. It was smooth. No hidden compartments, no strange markings. I put it all back together and set it on my coffee table. That evening, I decided to sleep on the couch, right there in the living room. I turned off all the lights except for a small lamp. I locked my doors and windows again, checking every latch. I even put a chair against the front door just to see if it would move if someone tried to get in. Then I sat on the couch with a baseball bat. It felt silly, but I was on edge. I kept the lamp on and stared at those frames. I couldn't focus on anything else. After a few hours, I dozed off. Around 2 in the morning, I jerked awake to a soft noise. It sounded like a faint clicking. My eyes snapped open. I sat up, gripping the bat. I looked at the wall with the pictures. The frames were still in place, at least from what I could see. The living room was silent. My heart was racing, but I couldn't see anything moving. I stayed there, wide awake, for another hour, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I got up feeling groggy. I checked each frame. They were all normal. I felt stupid for sleeping with a bat, but I also felt determined to figure out what was going on. I decided to change the lock on my front door. So I went to the hardware store, bought a new lock, and spent the afternoon installing it. I also added a small deadbolt for extra security. I told myself that if someone was picking the old lock, now they'd have a harder time. I went about my week as usual, but I felt uneasy. Every time I stepped into the living room, I checked the frames. They stayed where I left them. By Friday, I was feeling more relaxed. I hadn't made plans to visit my mother that weekend, so I stayed home. I did some cleaning, watched TV, cooked dinner. Around midnight, I was in the kitchen washing dishes. My living room light was off, but I left the hallway light on. I heard a faint thump. I turned off the faucet and listened. The house was quiet. I walked into the living room. My eyes adjusted to the darkness. My heart was pounding. I flicked on the lamp and stared at the wall. The frames were fine. I exhaled and turned to leave. Then I noticed something on the coffee table. The wedding photo was lying face down. I had put it back on the wall earlier that week. Now it was on the table, reversed. I felt goosebumps on my arms. I walked over and picked it up. The frame felt cold against my fingers. I checked the door. It was locked. The windows were shut. There was nobody else in the house. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. I put the photo in a drawer in my bedroom, hoping that out of sight would be out of mind. The next day, I went to the local locksmith. I asked him if there was any known way to pick or bypass the deadbolt I installed. He shrugged and said, everything is pickable if someone has the right tools and enough time, but that my lock was decent. I also thought about installing a security system, but part of me hesitated because I rent the place. I wasn't sure my landlord would approve. Still, I wanted to feel safe. I spent the rest of the day avoiding the living room. I sat in my office, worked on some reports, and tried to ignore the tension I felt. That evening, I decided to remove all the frames from the wall. I took down every single one and put them in a box. If something or someone was messing with those frames, maybe it would stop if they weren't there. My living room wall looked empty, but at least I didn't have to stare at those photos. I put the box in a corner. I could still see the brass frame with my grandparents' wedding photo tucked among the others. I tried to sleep that night, but I kept waking up. I heard the old wood floors creak now and then, but I told myself it was just the house settling. In the morning, I walked into the living room. My couch cushions were undisturbed. The box with the frames was still in the corner. Nothing was out of place. I felt relieved. Maybe it was over. But then, as I picked up the box to move it to my bedroom closet, I noticed the wedding photo sitting on top of the other frames. I had placed it at the bottom the night before. I remembered distinctly putting it underneath the other pictures because I didn't want to see it. Now it was on top, as if someone had lifted it out. My throat felt dry. I set the box down on the coffee table, my hand trembling. I ran to check my locks again. They were fine. No sign of anyone entering. I stood in the living room, breathing hard, staring at that photo. I placed it face down in the box, pushing it under the others. I told myself I'd get rid of it, but I couldn't bring myself to throw away my grandparents' wedding photo. It's part of my family history. I decided to store it somewhere less accessible. I found an old suitcase in the closet. I put the frame inside and zipped it up. Then I placed that suitcase in the attic. I was sweating the whole time, and my heart felt like it was beating in my ears. I haven't visited my mother in the countryside for a couple of weeks now. I told her I had work obligations. The truth is, I'm scared to leave my house. I'm scared of what I'll find when I come back. I still have no proof of any person breaking in. I have no explanation for how those frames end up flipped, or why it always targets certain photos. And I don't know why my grandparents' wedding picture is the main focus. I've done everything I can think of. New locks, a camera, searching the house. Nothing has solved it. I'm going to stay here a while longer, watching. I can't shake the feeling that there's something in my living room, something I can't see or hear. It doesn't leave signs of forced entry, but it chooses specific photos. I'm trying not to let my imagination run away from me, so I focus on what I can observe. Frames moved, locks untouched, no footprints, no broken windows. That's all I know. Right now, I'm just hoping it stops. But every time I look at my empty wall, I remember that box in the attic with the wedding photo. And I know that if I leave again, I might come home to find it flipped, even if it's locked away. I don't have an answer for any of this. I only know that something is going on and it's not random. I've seen it with my own eyes, and I can't explain it. I never expected a simple wooden door to shake me up so much. That pantry door sits right next to my fridge, almost invisible when I'm rushing around the kitchen. But ever since I first heard those 3 distinct knocks, tock, 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 my routine has changed. It happened late one night, and the sound was so clear that I stopped breathing for a second. I remember standing there, heart pounding. I pressed my ear against the wood. I didn't hear anything else. I opened the door, flipped on the light, and saw nothing unusual. Just cans and boxes stacked on the shelves. No cracks in the walls, no weird drafts, nothing. But my hands shook when I closed that door. I live alone in a small house just outside the city. It's not an old place, it was built maybe 10 years ago. The kitchen is small with white tiles and a simple layout. Fridge on one side, pantry door on the other, a small dining table in the middle. I don't store anything strange in the pantry, mostly canned vegetables, pasta, rice, cleaning supplies on the bottom shelf. The fridge buzzes sometimes, but I'm used to that. The pantry, though, has started giving off these knocks that come in bursts. Sometimes 3 in a row, sometimes 2, sometimes just one loud thud. Each time, it leaves me feeling tense. The knocks never follow a pattern I can predict. I remember the first night it happened. I had finished washing the dishes. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the fridge and the faint sound of traffic outside. I heard a short series of knocks, like someone tapping on the door from the inside. My body reacted before my brain could process it. My shoulders tensed, and my stomach felt tight. I dried my hands and walked over, trying to act calm. I opened the door fast, hoping to catch something in the act. But I saw nothing. Everything was in its place. I nudged some cans around, looked behind the shelves. Not a thing. I closed the door slowly, feeling a dull ache in my chest from holding my breath too long. That was the first night I felt uneasy in my own kitchen. The next day I tried to reason it out. Maybe there was a pipe behind the wall. Maybe the ventilation was causing the wood to pop. I even checked outside to see if a branch was hitting the house. Nothing. The wall behind the pantry was solid. No external damage. No leaky pipes, just normal drywall and insulation. I told myself I was overreacting. Then a week went by with no knocks. I almost forgot about it. But the following Saturday I heard it again. I was eating a late dinner, watching some video on my phone, when I heard 3 strong knocks from the pantry door. I jumped to my feet so fast I almost knocked over my glass of water. I turned off the video and listened. My heart was racing. I heard a faint creak, like the wood was settling. I got up and walked over. My palms were damp. I grabbed the doorknob and opened it. Again, nothing but cans, boxes of cereal, and a few plastic containers. I flicked the light on, stared at the shelves for a moment, and closed the door. I stood there, feeling my pulse throb in my neck. I tried to shrug it off, but I couldn't relax. I started to dread going into the kitchen at night. During the day, the place felt normal. Sunlight through the window, a little clutter on the counter, the usual chores. But once darkness fell, I became hyper-aware of every small noise. The fridge humming, the floor creaking under my feet, the clock ticking on the wall. Sometimes I heard a quick knock, but when I focused on it, I wasn't sure if it had been real. Other times I heard nothing. Each silent minute felt heavy. One evening, the knocks sounded more urgent. I was cleaning up after dinner. The sink was full of soapy water, and I had music playing on my phone. Then I heard it, loud and clear. Tock, tock, tock. I turned off the music right away and listened. It happened again. This time it sounded like a fist hitting the inside of the door. My chest tightened. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I grabbed a towel and dried my hands. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might hear it echo. I walked to the pantry, put one hand on the doorknob, and paused. Another set of knocks echoed. I opened the door in a rush. The inside was empty and quiet, lit by the single bulb overhead. The air smelled a bit stale, like old cardboard and dust. I scanned every shelf. Cans, jars, no sign of anything that could make that noise. I stood there for a moment, then closed the door. I'm not going to lie. I felt a chill in my spine. The idea of something or someone knocking from inside my pantry got stuck in my head. I wondered if I was just hearing normal house noises and translating them into something more. But the knocks sounded too deliberate. They came in short bursts, always with that same pattern, like a person tapping their knuckles on the wood. After a few more incidents, I decided to record it. I set my phone inside the pantry one evening before I went to bed. I just pressed the record button on a voice memo app, left it on a shelf, and closed the door. I told myself I'd check it in the morning. I hardly slept that night. I kept picturing the phone sitting in the dark pantry while something tapped or breathed in there. I got up early to retrieve it. I played the recording while I made coffee. The audio had almost 2 hours of silence with occasional clicks or static, but then I heard a faint sound that made my skin crawl. It was like a soft breath. It lasted for a couple of seconds, then stopped. A few minutes later, there were light taps, maybe 2 or 3. They were quiet, but they were there. I listened a few more times. I couldn't figure out if the breathing sound was just the microphone picking up something else, like a shift in air pressure or me moving in the house, but it sounded organic, like an exhale. I didn't hear a clear voice, just that breath and a few taps. My hands shook when I realized it was recorded in the middle of the night, while I was in bed. That was enough to make me very cautious about opening the pantry. I began to avoid going in there unless it was absolutely necessary. My cooking changed. Instead of using the supplies I had in the pantry, I started buying more takeout. When I needed something from inside, I'd do it quickly, grab it and leave. I tried to act calm, but I always felt my shoulders tense up when I turned the knob. The door itself looked the same as always. It's a plain, white door with a simple handle. Nothing special about the hinges or the frame. One time I decided to do a thorough inspection. I pulled everything out of the pantry. Boxes, cans, cleaning products. All of it went onto the kitchen table. I checked the walls, knocked on every plank of wood, looked for gaps, signs of insects, mold, anything. The walls were solid. No cracks, no hollow spots that could hide rodents or anything like that. The corners were fine. No stains or strange marks. The shelves were in good condition. The door itself wasn't loose. Everything looked normal. I put everything back, feeling more frustrated than before. The knocks continued, though not every night. Sometimes I'd go a couple of weeks without hearing them. Then I'd be sitting at my table, finishing dinner, and I'd hear 2 hard knocks, always from that door. My physical reactions became more noticeable each time. I'd feel a tightness in my stomach, a slight tremor in my legs. My mouth would go dry. I'd find myself swallowing hard when I heard something unusual. In my head, I kept thinking, this is ridiculous. It's just a pantry. But every time it happened, that adrenaline spike told me otherwise. I also tried to look for external causes. I considered whether my fridge could be vibrating against the pantry. I pulled the fridge away from the wall by a few inches. That changed nothing. I checked the outside walls again. Everything was intact. I asked my neighbor if he had ever heard strange noises, but he just shrugged and said no. I didn't tell him much, because I felt silly bringing up ghost stories or something like that. Still, I wanted to rule out any normal explanation. Late one night, around midnight, I was in the living room watching a show on TV. I had a clear line of sight to the kitchen. The door to the pantry was closed, the lights off. I was about to doze off, but then I noticed a small movement. My heart thumped. I sat up straight and turned off the TV. I watched the pantry door, thinking I might have imagined it. Then I heard a single knock. Just one. I got up and walked over, slow and quiet. I stood in front of the pantry. My pulse was loud in my ears. I reached for the doorknob, paused for a second, then turned it. The door opened with a low squeak. I reached in, and flicked the light switch. The shelves looked normal. Everything was as I had left it. The air felt still. I stood there listening until I felt a knot in my neck from tension. I closed the door and walked back to the couch, wide awake. I didn't hear anything else that night. I thought about buying a small camera to place inside, but the idea of watching hours of footage of my pantry unnerved me. Part of me didn't want to see anything moving around. Hearing it was bad enough. I still have that audio file on my phone, with the quiet breath and a few soft knocks. Every time I think about deleting it, I hesitate. It's proof that something weird is going on. At times I wondered if I was going crazy, but I know what I heard. And I have the recording. My biggest worry was that there might be a practical explanation I was missing, like a structural issue or some animal that got inside the walls. I hired a handyman to come check it out once just to be sure. He looked around for about an hour, checked the attic and the crawl space. He didn't find any leaks, no signs of animals or insects, no mold. He knocked on the pantry walls, listened, and said everything seemed fine. I thanked him, paid him, and he left. The very next night, I heard the knocks again. Sometimes I get fed up and just shout, "Stop," when I hear that tapping. I feel a bit foolish talking to a door, but I do it anyway. Most of the time, it results in silence. Other times, I might hear one faint knock afterward, almost like a response. My mind starts racing, but I force myself not to think about it too much. A few weeks ago, the knock stopped for almost a month. I got comfortable again, thinking maybe it was over. The pantry felt like a normal closet. I used the items in there as usual. I forgot the tension for a bit. But then one night I was in bed when I heard a loud bang from the kitchen. It wasn't subtle. It was like someone slammed their hand against the door. My heart felt like it skipped a beat. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. I crept into the hallway, staying close to the wall. My breath was shallow. My mouth was dry. I reached the kitchen and saw the pantry door still closed. Nothing else seemed out of place. I flicked on the overhead light. Everything looked normal. The fridge hummed. The clock on the microwave showed it was almost 2 a.m. I stared at the pantry, bracing for another knock. None came. I opened the door with trembling hands. It looked fine inside. My chest felt tight, and I realized I was taking quick, shallow breaths. I closed the door and went back to bed, though I didn't sleep much that night. That's where things stand now. I live with this weird knocking noise that comes and goes. I have an audio recording of breathing and taps. The pantry itself looks completely normal. I keep checking it, half expecting to find some hidden entrance or a damaged spot in the wall, but there's nothing. On some days I think about moving to a new place, just to get away from this constant anxiety. But that's a big step, and it feels extreme to leave my house because of a door. I've told a couple of friends about it, and they don't know what to say. I don't have answers either. These days, I go about my life, but I stay alert whenever I'm in the kitchen. If I have to open the pantry, I do it quickly. I don't stand there too long. Sometimes I knock on the door myself before I open it, just to see if anything answers. Usually it's silent. Every so often I hear a light tap in response. I stand there, feeling my heartbeat speed up. Then I open the door, see everything normal, and close it again. I don't know what's behind those knocks. I can't explain the breathing sound on the recording. I just know it's there. For now, I live with it. I try not to let it consume me, but I'll admit I think about it every time I step into the kitchen after dark. My biggest fear is hearing that knock when I'm standing right in front of the door. I'm afraid of what I might do if that happens. Will I open it fast again, or will I turn and walk away? I'm not sure. For now, I guess I'll keep listening, waiting for the next knock. I came home one evening, tossed my keys on the kitchen counter, and flopped onto the couch with the same tired routine I had practiced for years. That's when I noticed it again. The remote wasn't where I left it. My throat tightened, and I felt a surge of adrenaline shoot up my spine. It wasn't under the cushions, and it wasn't on the coffee table. I found it perched on the windowsill, balanced at an angle that didn't look like an accident. That was the third time this week I'd discovered it in a strange place. But this time, the sight of it left me with a prickling sensation on my skin. It felt like someone was daring me to ask questions. I'm a pretty ordinary guy. I work a straightforward job at a small accounting firm. I keep my apartment in decent shape, but I'm not a neat freak. I like to relax in front of the TV as soon as I get home. That's my wind down time, my way of telling myself the day is done. Normally I grab a cold drink, grab the remote, and let my mind drift. But these last few weeks, something has changed. I notice small things at first. The remote on a different side of the table, or turned upside down. I assumed I'd placed it that way and forgotten. But then it started appearing in spots I never use. The windowsill was the first place I found it. Another time, I saw it resting on top of a tall bookshelf in the hallway, which forced me to grab a stool to reach it. At first I tried to shrug it off. Maybe I'd set it down without thinking. Maybe I was absent-minded after a long day at work. But I couldn't ignore how deliberately it was placed. It was never dropped or fallen behind something. It was always in plain sight, balanced in a way that required a steady hand. One time it was perched on the corner of the console table in the hallway, half of it hanging off the edge. That made no sense to me because I don't even bring the remote out of the living room. I felt an uncomfortable, jittery feeling in my stomach when I saw it. My pulse sped up, and I checked the locks on my front door. They were secured, just like I'd left them. Things got weirder about a week later. I decided to run a small test. I placed the remote next to me on the couch, right on the armrest. I took a photo on my phone to document its position. Then I stood up and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. I glanced at the microwave clock on my way in. 6:42 p.m. By 6:43, I was heading back to the living room. I'm talking 1 minute away, maybe less. But the remote wasn't on the armrest anymore. It sat on the coffee table, angled as if someone had turned it to face the TV. My heart thumped in my chest. The air felt thick. I grabbed my phone and looked at the time. It read 6:44. That's all it took, a couple of minutes. Yet I hadn't heard a single sound. My apartment was dead quiet. I felt a light sweat on the back of my neck. I glanced around, checked the bedroom, checked the closets, even the bathroom. Nothing. I told myself I was overreacting. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I moved it and forgot. But my gut told me that was a lie. My hands were shaking a bit when I sat back down. I turned on the TV, but I couldn't focus on the show. My eyes kept drifting to the corners of the room like I was waiting for something to dart out. I didn't see anything, so I forced myself to calm down. It was hard to shake that crawling feeling on my arms. Over the next few days, I tried a few more tests. One morning, I placed the remote on the edge of the coffee table before leaving for work. When I got back that evening, I found it standing upright against a lamp in the corner of the room. It was as if someone had propped it there like a display item. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. I felt this tightness in my chest and a tingle in my face. It reminded me of the feeling you get when you know you're being watched. I walked around, checked every window. They were locked from the inside. The door was locked too. Nothing else seemed moved or missing. My TV, laptop, and all my electronics were where they should be. It was just the remote, always out of place, always arranged in a bizarre position. I tried telling a friend about it, but he laughed and said I should cut back on the coffee. I didn't push it. The story sounded ridiculous, and I probably came across as paranoid, so I kept it to myself and tried to gather more proof. I considered setting up a camera. I even checked prices online for some basic home security cameras, but every time I added one to my cart, I hesitated. I couldn't explain that hesitation. It felt like I was stepping into territory that might escalate the situation. Still, my curiosity got the better of me after one more incident. That night, I placed my phone on a bookshelf, pointed at the couch and the table. I hit record on the video camera. Then I left the room for a short break. I lingered in the hallway with my hand pressed against my mouth, trying not to make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. After about 4 minutes, I tiptoed back in. The remote was gone from the couch. It was now sitting on the windowsill again next to a small potted plant. My phone was still recording. My arms shook as I picked up the phone and pressed stop. I played the video back right away, hunched over the device. The video showed the remote resting on the couch. Then there was a small flicker in the footage, like a glitch or a brief static line. After that, the remote was just gone. The entire moment of it moving was missing. It was a clean break in the recording, a tiny jump. There was no sign of anything crossing the screen, no movement at all, just that flicker, and then an empty spot on the couch. I felt nauseous. My lips felt dry, and I swallowed hard, but my throat felt thick. That flicker in the video disturbed me more than anything else that had happened so far. It confirmed something was messing with me, and it was able to avoid being captured on camera. I spent about an hour replaying it, even tried to watch it frame by frame. Nothing else showed up. I couldn't decide if I felt scared or angry. My heart wouldn't slow down, and my palms were sweaty. I paced around the living room, turning lights on and off, checking the hallway, the bedroom, the bathroom. I kept expecting a shadow or some sign of an intruder, but there was nothing. The next few days I felt on edge every time I came home. I'd slip in through the door and pause, listening. I noticed my breathing was faster than normal. I'd feel my leg muscles tighten like I was ready to bolt. I'd creep into the living room with a sense of dread. The remote was never in the same spot twice. Sometimes I found it behind a curtain, sometimes on the windowsill, other times on top of the TV stand. It was always in a place that forced me to notice it right away. And it was always in plain view, as though placed deliberately. I started turning on all the lights, even in rooms I wasn't using, just to feel less vulnerable. One night, after a stressful day at work, I decided I had to test something else. I took the batteries out of the remote. I figured if something was messing with the device, maybe it needed power. So I removed the batteries and placed the remote face down on the coffee table. I went to brush my teeth and change into more comfortable clothes, staying alert for any sound. About 10 minutes later, I returned to the living room. The remote was standing upright against the couch cushion with no batteries inside. My stomach clenched. I felt lightheaded for a moment, and I grasped the back of the couch for support. My breathing grew shallow. I checked the empty battery compartment. The batteries were still lying on the coffee table. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I felt beads of sweat forming on my forehead. I kept thinking about how impossible it seemed. Something was playing with me, and it didn't rely on normal physical rules. I glanced around, expecting to see a shape or a face. But I saw only my familiar furniture, the faint glare from the TV screen, and the overhead light flickering slightly. My ears were straining for any sound. A footstep, a whisper, something. I heard my refrigerator hum in the kitchen. I heard a car horn outside. Nothing else. I decided I had to speak out loud, even if it made me look crazy. So I said, "I know you're here. I know you're taking the remote." My voice sounded shaky. I wasn't sure what I expected to happen, but I wanted to see if there'd be a reaction. At first, nothing changed. Then I felt a cold draft pass over my arms, though my windows were closed. Goosebumps rose on my skin. It felt like a silent acknowledgement, but I couldn't see anything. My heart thumped in my chest. I stood there for a while, unsure of what to do next. Finally, I sat down on the couch, still holding the remote. I placed the batteries back inside and turned on the TV. I tried to distract myself with the usual late-night shows, but my gaze kept sliding to the corners of the room. Every time there was a commercial break, I'd glance around, expecting to see the remote shift positions or float away. But it stayed right there in my hand. I started turning off the TV earlier than usual. I stopped leaving the remote lying around. Instead, I kept it in a kitchen drawer. But somehow it always returned to the living room. One morning I discovered it on the windowsill again, just like before. I slammed the drawer shut and felt a burst of frustration. My hands were shaking. I wanted to shout. I wanted to demand that whatever was messing with me come out in the open. The tension of not knowing was too much. I tried sleeping in the bedroom with the door locked. I thought maybe that sense of security would help me rest, but each morning I'd find the remote somewhere else in the apartment, sometimes on a table, sometimes on a shelf, once on top of my stacked laundry. It never moved while I watched, though. It always waited until I turned my back. My mental state felt raw. I woke up feeling tired, even though I was in bed for hours. My shoulders felt stiff, and I had a constant dull ache in my lower back. My appetite dropped. I found myself eating quick snacks instead of proper meals. 2 weeks later, I gave up trying to hide the remote. I left it on the coffee table one night, deciding to see what would happen. I sat on the couch with all the lights on, phone in hand, ready to record. I waited. My eyes burned from staring at the remote without blinking. My stomach churned. After about an hour, I heard a mild click from the hallway. I froze. I aimed my phone toward the noise, hands trembling. Nothing moved. I felt a knot tighten in my gut. I walked toward the hallway, keeping the phone's camera up. I didn't see anything. When I turned back to the living room, the remote was gone. It happened in those few seconds. My jaw clenched, and I stumbled toward the coffee table, scanning every inch of it. I lifted cushions, glanced under the table. The remote was nowhere in sight. I glanced toward the window, and there it was, perched on the sill again. I didn't see it move. It was just there. I recorded a few seconds of it, my breath shaky, my hand unsteady. In that moment, I felt a strange wave of acceptance. Something was sharing my space, and it enjoyed messing with my routine. It didn't harm me, and it never damaged anything else. It focused on that remote, and it left everything else alone. My fear lingered, but part of me felt a small sense of relief. At least it wasn't trying to hurt me. It was just pushing my limits, like it wanted my attention. Since that night, I've continued to live here. The remote still disappears and reappears in odd places. I still feel uneasy, but I try to keep my reactions in check. Sometimes I speak out loud when it happens. I say, "Very funny. I'm putting the remote back now." I don't know if that means anything to whatever is here. I still get that crawling sensation on my arms, and I break into a cold sweat when I notice it's missing. But I've stopped denying it. I know I'm not just losing track of where I set it. I make sure my doors are locked every night. I keep the windows closed. I accept that some presence, something unseen, likes to move my remote. It hasn't grown more aggressive, and it hasn't done anything worse than play these pranks. I don't tell most people about it. The ones I did tell didn't believe me or thought I was overworked. But it's not in my head. I see it happen. I see the remote in a spot I would never choose. I feel the cold draft on my arms when I call it out. My pulse races, my muscles tense, and sometimes I break out in a sudden sweat. But that's my new normal now. I haven't moved out. I can't say I'm comfortable, but I'm coping. Every day when I walk through the door, my chest tightens for a second, and I brace myself to see where the remote is. Sometimes it's right where I left it. Other days, it's balanced on the edge of the windowsill or perched on a shelf. Each time I take a deep breath, pick it up, and carry on. If I'm being honest, I think whatever it is wants to stay. I don't see signs that it plans to leave. It's here, and it likes to make me jump. That's my life now, just me, my TV, and a remote that refuses to stay put. It's not a story I ever wanted to have, but it's the one I'm living. I can't explain it, and I've stopped trying to run from it. All I know is when I sit down to watch my favorite show, I keep a close eye on the remote. I hold it tight in my hand. It disappears less often if I never let go, but sometimes I still get thirsty or need to answer the phone. Then, the minute I step away, I feel that knot in my stomach, and I wonder if the remote will be gone again. Usually it is, and I find it somewhere else, sitting quietly, like it's waiting for me to notice. I never thought my late-night commute would push me to the edge of my nerves. I always felt a little uneasy taking the subway after midnight, but it was cheaper than a cab, and it beat walking home for an hour in the dark. Most nights, I was just tired. I'd slump in my seat, stare at my phone, and try not to doze off. But one night, something changed. I saw someone in the reflection of the window. When I turned to look, no one was there. I'm going to explain exactly what happened. I can only talk about what I saw, what I heard, and how it made me feel. I won't dress it up or give it fancy meaning. I'll just tell you what happened so you can understand why I'm still shaken. I work a security job in an office tower. My shift ends around midnight, sometimes a bit later if I have to wait for my replacement. That night I got out at about 12:30 a.m. I remember checking my phone as I stood on the platform. The station was almost empty, which was normal. Maybe 2 or 3 other people waited down the line, but nobody stood close to me. I heard the faint sound of an approaching train, that loud rumble and the hum of the electric rails. I was relieved because all I wanted was to sit down and rest my feet. The train arrived and the doors slid open. I got on, found a seat near the middle, and dropped into it. The car was quiet. The overhead lights were steady, but they seemed a bit harsh. I set my backpack on the floor between my legs. I noticed an older man at the far end, sitting with his eyes closed. Another passenger, a woman, was closer, scrolling on her phone. Otherwise, the car was empty. We pulled away from the station. I leaned my head back and stared at the window across from me. Sometimes I like to watch the reflection of the fluorescent lights flicker by. It's more interesting than looking at the dark tunnels. But that's when I saw it. A person standing by the doors behind me. I could see the shape in the reflection. They had a hood up over their head, arms crossed in front. It was just a faint silhouette, but it looked human. I blinked and felt a weird jolt in my chest. My stomach clenched. I suddenly felt hot, like the temperature around me jumped. I turned around to see who it was. No one was there. The doorway area behind me was empty. I stared at the metal pole and the empty space near the doors. My mouth went dry. I turned back to the window and looked at the reflection again. The figure was there, standing in that same spot, arms crossed, head tilted forward. I took a sharp breath and held it. My hands felt clammy. Maybe I'm just tired, I thought. I'm seeing things because I'm exhausted. I glanced at the other passengers. The older man kept his head down. The woman was still on her phone. Neither of them reacted. I rubbed my eyes, tried to calm down, and looked again. The reflection didn't move. It just stayed there, hood over its head. I couldn't make out a face. I felt my heart pounding. I tried to ignore it and pulled out my phone. I checked social media. My fingers were shaky. I was scrolling without reading anything. My eyes kept drifting back to the window. Every time I saw that shape in the glass, I didn't want to believe it was real. I forced my gaze back to my phone, but I couldn't focus. My back was tense and my neck felt stiff. At the next station, the train doors opened. The older man stood up and left. The woman also stepped off. Now it was just me in the car, or at least that's what it looked like when I checked around. I could see into the neighboring cars through the connecting door, but nobody else was around. The station platform was empty too. The doors slid shut and we started moving again. The squeal of the wheels on the track jolted me. Alone in the car, I felt exposed. I looked at the window again. The reflection was still there. I whipped my head around. Nothing. I got up slowly and moved toward the seat across the aisle. I wanted to see if changing my position would change the reflection. But as soon as I sat down, I caught a glimpse of the reflection in the new window. The figure seemed closer. I felt my breathing speed up. My throat was tight. I looked at the actual doorway. There was no one. Still empty. Just that metal pole and the dirty floor. I wiped sweat off my forehead. My body felt cold even though I was sweating. I stood up again and tried moving to the other end of the car. Each step made me more anxious. The lights buzzed overhead. The seats were all empty. My footsteps felt loud against the floor. I settled in a seat near the far door. I took a moment to breathe and steady my hands on my knees. I looked back at the middle window from that new angle, just to see if I could spot the reflection again. It was still there in the glass. The figure hadn't changed its posture. Arms crossed, hood up. It looked like it was facing me now, though. I couldn't see eyes, but I felt like it was staring. I swallowed hard and tried to calm myself. I wasn't sure what to do. My stop was still a few stations away, so jumping off too soon would mean a long walk alone at night. I told myself I could handle a few more minutes. At each station, the doors opened and closed. Sometimes one or two people stepped into the adjacent cars, but they never came into mine. No one sat near me. No one noticed anything. I kept checking the seats behind me, the area near the doors, the glass reflections. The figure never appeared in real life. It only showed up in the reflection. Then we got to my station. I was so ready to leave that I grabbed my bag before the train fully stopped. I rushed toward the sliding doors. I paused right before stepping out because something told me to look at the reflection one last time. I glanced at the window to my left. The figure was standing there, arms at its sides now. It lifted its head so I could see where its face should have been. I couldn't make out normal features. It was like a blur of skin and shadow. I saw no eyes, no mouth, but it felt like it was looking at me directly. My chest felt like it was going to explode. A sudden panic swept through me, and I bolted out of the train. The doors hissed shut behind me. The subway car pulled away, leaving a rush of stale air. I stood on the platform, breathing fast. My heart hammered against my ribs. My palms were damp. I kept looking at the receding train through the tunnel, half expecting the figure to be staring out a window at me. All I saw were dull lights and the backs of empty seats. I forced myself to move. My legs felt shaky, but I took the stairs to the main concourse of the station. The place was mostly deserted. I heard my own footsteps echo. My breath sounded loud in my ears. I kept scanning the walls, the corners, any reflective surface. I saw my own reflection in the metal doors of a closed kiosk, but nothing else. I tried to calm down by focusing on the physical stuff around me. The flickering overhead light near the exit, the wet patches on the floor, the smell of old concrete. I reached the turnstiles and tapped my card to leave. My hands were still trembling. I walked through the corridor, heading toward the street exit. There was a long set of glass panels on one side, and I glanced over at them out of habit. There in the reflection, I saw that shape again, just a silhouette behind me in the corridor. I spun around. No one was there. My whole body tensed up. My mouth felt dry. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I walked faster. My boots scuffed the tiled floor. I tried to keep my eyes straight ahead because looking at the reflections was making me sweat. But some weird urge pulled my attention back to the glass. I glanced to the side again and saw it once more. It wasn't just standing. It looked like it was leaning forward, arms dangling, hood covering what should be a head. I felt a chill in my limbs. My gut tightened, and I let out a shaky breath. I reached the escalator that led to the street. It wasn't running at this hour, so I had to climb the still escalator steps. They were steep, and I forced my legs to move quickly, even though they were burning with each step. I kept hearing my own breathing. I didn't want to hear anything else because I was afraid I might hear footsteps behind me. At the top, I pushed through the heavy metal door that opened to the sidewalk. The cool night air hit my face, and I felt a slight rush of relief. The station was behind me now, but I couldn't shake the dread. I turned around to check the door's glass. I didn't see anything on the other side, just the faint light in the station corridor. I tried to calm down. Maybe it's over, I thought. I started walking along the street. The sidewalks were almost empty. One or two cars passed. A few streetlights flickered. I kept a steady pace, moving toward my apartment building 5 blocks away. The city felt bigger and quieter than usual at this hour. I heard a distant horn, some rattling garbage in an alley, and the hum of a nearby transformer. My ears were alert to every sound, searching for footsteps or breathing that didn't belong to me. I reached my apartment building's door. The entrance had reflective glass, and my pulse spiked as I realized I'd have to look at it to open the door. I slowed down and took a breath. My hand hovered over the handle. I glanced at the glass. I saw my reflection, pale and sweaty. I didn't see the hooded figure. I let out a small, shaky sigh and pulled the door open. Inside, the lobby was lit by a single fluorescent panel. It had a front desk that stayed empty at night. I walked over to the elevator. The elevator doors were mirrored steel, scuffed from years of use. My stomach twisted at the idea of seeing that reflection again. I pressed the call button. The light on the button glowed orange. I waited. The elevator arrived with a faint ding. The doors slid open. I stepped in and pressed my floor button. As the doors began to close, I felt a rush of tension. I looked at the mirrored panel inside. At first, all I saw was me, hunched and tired. Then for a split second, I swore the lights flickered. I saw a dark silhouette behind me. My breath caught in my throat. When the light steadied, there was nothing. Just me. I tried to calm myself by focusing on the elevator's hum. I got off on my floor and walked quickly to my door. My hands shook as I jammed the key in the lock. The hallway was silent except for the faint buzz from a ceiling light. I entered my apartment and slammed the door behind me, locking it. I stood there in the small entryway, breathing hard. My body felt exhausted. I wanted to drop everything and collapse onto my couch, but my mind was racing. I turned on every light in the living room and the small kitchen. I walked around, checking the windows. I live on a higher floor, so no one was going to peek in from outside. I kept thinking about the reflection I saw on the train, in the station corridor, in the mirrored elevator doors. I wanted to tell myself it was a trick of the light or a byproduct of being overworked, but I couldn't forget that feeling, like it was always watching me in the glass. I sat on my couch, hunched over, staring at my phone. I considered calling a friend, but I didn't know what I would say. I'm seeing someone in the reflection, but not in real life. It sounded ridiculous. My heart was still pounding, and I felt a knot in my stomach. I looked over at the black screen of my TV. I saw my reflection sitting on the couch. That's all I saw. No hooded figure, just me, looking terrified. I realized I was shaking my leg nervously, so I tried to stop and calm my muscles. I felt the tension in my shoulders. My neck was stiff. I took a few deep breaths. The apartment was dead quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Eventually, I got up, went to the bathroom, and splashed water on my face. I caught my reflection in the mirror. I didn't see anything else there, just my own tired expression. I decided to keep the lights on for the night. I dropped onto my bed, fully clothed, but I couldn't sleep right away. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that hooded figure hovering over me. My skin crawled at the thought of it standing there just out of sight, waiting for me to look in a window or a mirror so it could appear again. I don't know how long it took me to fall asleep, but I know I kept one eye open, scanning the dark corners of my apartment. Eventually, my exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up sore and tired. I checked every mirror in my apartment. Nothing unusual showed up. No dark shapes. No silhouettes. The subway seemed like a bad dream, but it felt too real to dismiss. I had to go to work again that evening. I dreaded the ride home that night, worried I'd see that reflection again. I can't say I ever figured it out. Sometimes I catch a flicker in a window or a faint outline in the corner of my vision, and it makes my heart race. But when I look directly, there's nothing. I haven't told any coworkers about it because I don't want them thinking I'm losing it. I keep hoping it was just exhaustion or stress, but I can't forget what I saw. I can't forget the way that hooded shape slowly raised its head in the window. I can't forget the feeling that followed me off the train and through the station. Even in my own apartment, I felt watched. That night made me aware of every reflective surface around me. It made me question what might be lurking just beyond my field of vision. I haven't seen it in full view again, but I still get that rush of anxiety whenever I'm on an empty train car, sitting near a window, watching the reflection of the fluorescent lights slide by. Sometimes I think I see a faint shape in the corner of the glass. I look again and it's gone. That's my story. I can't dress it up with explanations or hidden meanings. I only know what I saw and how it made me feel. I've never been good at dealing with things I can't explain. All I can do is keep riding that train and hope I never see that hooded figure staring back at me again. If I do, I'm not sure what will happen, but I know I'll feel that raw panic in my gut, and I'll remember that sense of being followed by something that only shows up in reflections. For now, all I can do is stay alert and hope that whatever I saw decides to leave me alone. I never expected an old house to make me question my senses, yet here I am, still feeling a chill in my bones when I think about what happened. My fiancé and I bought this place because we wanted something with character. It looked sturdy enough on the outside, even though it clearly needed work. We stepped inside on the day we got the keys, and we realized there were no real doors inside, only door frames. The windows were missing a lot of glass panes. The walls had cracks, and some spots showed signs of water damage. We told ourselves we'd fix it up slowly on weekends. We were excited. We wanted a home that we could shape to our own style. Things changed on the first night we tried to get some work done late. It was around midnight. We were in the living room going over paint swatches. The open windows were letting in a draft, so we decided to call it a night. Right when we were about to leave, I heard a door slam upstairs. It sounded forceful, like someone grabbed a door and threw it shut. I looked at my fiancée. She had her eyebrows raised and her shoulders tightened. She whispered, "What was that?" I had no idea. We went upstairs to see what caused the noise. Our flashlight beams bounced across the exposed floorboards. We found nothing. There were no doors. Each bedroom only had a bare frame. It made no sense. We checked the windows. They were loose in some spots, but not enough to create a heavy slam. We checked each room. No footprints, no sign of an intruder. The upstairs was cold, but I assumed it was just the night air. We told ourselves we might have imagined it. We locked up and went home. That sound stayed in my mind. Over the next few days, we joked about it. We said, "The house must be telling us it needs new doors." But I felt a little uneasy, like there was something wrong about that noise. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded angry. My fiancée laughed it off during the day, but she jumped at small sounds after that. I tried to keep us both calm, reminding her the house was old, with air leaks everywhere. The next weekend, we planned to paint the downstairs rooms and maybe rip up some ancient carpet on the stairs. We brought along some sleeping bags so we could crash there if we got too tired to drive back. We arrived early Saturday morning. The place was quiet. I opened the windows for ventilation. We hauled in paint cans and started scraping walls. We worked most of the day, sweating and coughing from the dust. Around 9 p.m., we decided to grab a bite at a diner down the street. By 11 p.m., we were back in the house. I set up our sleeping bags in the living room because it was the cleanest spot. We had a work light plugged in, giving us a harsh yellow glow. I turned it off to save power. We used our flashlights for any last-minute tasks. The house felt still, like it was waiting for something. My fiancée sat on her sleeping bag, checking her phone signal. She looked tense. I felt it too. My stomach had a slight knot. I tried to reassure her. I said, "We'll make more progress tomorrow. Let's get some rest." She nodded, turned on a small battery-powered lantern, and lay down. At around 1 a.m., I heard that noise again. It was a door slam, louder than before. It echoed through the hallways. My fiancée gasped. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. My hands felt cold. I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the stairs. She called after me, "Be careful." I didn't wait. I took the steps 2 at a time. I reached the second-floor hallway. My breath was heavy. The air felt different. It was cold, and I could feel a slight pressure in my ears. The hallway was dark except for my flashlight beam. No wind was blowing in from the windows. Yet I felt a breeze or a draft on my face. I walked to each doorway. I pointed the flashlight inside. The bedrooms were empty. The floors were stripped down to old planks. The walls had chipped paint. One of the rooms had a closet frame, but again, no door. Everything was as we left it. I saw no sign of movement. But then my flashlight caught something on one of the door frames. It looked like smudges or streaks. I got closer. They were marks shaped like hands. I traced them with my flashlight. The marks looked pressed into the wood, like someone with dusty or dirty hands had gripped the frame. They were around the height of a person's shoulders, as if someone had pushed both hands into the frame with force. A shiver ran up my spine. The night air felt colder than before. I held my breath for a moment, listening. I heard my fiancée's footsteps on the stairs behind me. She asked, "What is it?" I shone the light on the frame. She saw the handprints. She stared. I reached out to touch them. The surface felt rough and cold. I pulled my hand away. My pulse was still racing. We stood there, just breathing, taking in the strange silence. I didn't hear any more slams that night. But we didn't sleep well. We dragged our sleeping bags upstairs to see if we could hear something else, but nothing happened. We lay there with flashlights off, listening for any shift in the air, any footstep. By morning, I felt an ache in my back from the hard floor. My fiancé looked exhausted. We avoided talking about what happened. We had a job to do, so we went downstairs, boiled some water on a portable electric burner, and tried to shake off the night. Later that afternoon, we tried to sand the door frame with the hand marks. We wanted to see if it was just dirt or some old stain. The marks seemed to be in the wood itself, like the material was compressed. The more I sanded, the more they just looked like deep impressions. I kept stopping to look behind me, expecting a door to slam. Each time the hallway was empty and quiet. We finished up the weekend without another incident. We left the house that Sunday evening, both of us feeling uneasy. We drove back to our apartment in near silence. My fiancé asked me once, "Do you think we should bring someone else in there with us next time?" I shrugged. I didn't know if that would help. The house felt different after that night. It felt like something hovered in the air, waiting for us to return. Over the next week, I tried to focus on work. My boss noticed I was jumpy. I kept checking my phone, looking at photos of the house, thinking about those hand marks. My fiancé texted me questions. Should we replace the windows first? Or fix the frames? Should we install doors? Each question made me remember that slam in the night. I typed back my best answers. I tried not to dwell on it too much. When we went back the next weekend, it was quiet again. We worked on the living room and the kitchen. We replaced some window glass. We installed temporary plastic covers in a few spots. We brought in some new tools. We were almost comfortable until about 9 p.m. My fiancée began tapping her foot on the floor, glancing at the ceiling. She asked if we should leave. I reminded her we'd promised ourselves we'd stay until Sunday afternoon to get more work done. She nodded. We tried to watch a movie on her laptop for a break. The internet signal was weak, so we ended up watching something we had saved. We tried to laugh. We tried to ignore the tension. Around 11 p.m., we decided to get some sleep. We set up our sleeping bags on the second-floor hallway this time, right near the door frame with the handprints. I wanted to see if anything would happen. I was nervous, but I also felt determined to face whatever this was. We dozed off. The floor was hard, and the hallway had an odd draft. Around 2 a.m. as I woke up, I checked my phone for the time. Everything was quiet. No slams, no creaks. I thought, maybe it's done. Maybe it was just weird airflow. Then I heard something like a scratch. It came from the room with the closet. It was faint, but I felt the hairs on my arm stand up. I reached for the flashlight. My fiancée stirred and opened her eyes. She whispered, "What's that?" I held up a hand, signaling her to wait. I crawled toward the door frame and aimed the flashlight inside the room. The scratching sound stopped. We both got on our feet. We stepped into the room. It smelled a bit musty, like damp wood. No sign of anything moving. Then the door frame behind us made a quick cracking sound. It sounded like wood snapping. We spun around and pointed the flashlight. Those handprint impressions looked even deeper in the beam of light. Neither of us spoke. I felt a drop of sweat roll down my temple. My throat was dry. We backed away until we were in the hallway again. We didn't sleep after that. We sat on the top step of the stairs until the sun came up. In the morning, I tried to examine the frame again. The wood felt solid, but there were new hairline cracks around the area where the handprints were. It was as if the wood was warping under some sort of pressure. I stood there, my stomach tight, thinking about that door slam. The place had no doors upstairs, so what was slamming? Why did the noise come from above? My fiancée said she wanted to bring in a contractor to look at that specific frame. I agreed. We packed up early and left. The contractor came the following Friday. He was an older man who'd seen all kinds of strange things in old houses. He poked around, tapping the wood, checking the walls. He said the structure was sound, but he pointed out some unusual warping in that doorway. He said he'd never seen that exact pattern before. He asked if we'd had a heavy door hung there. I told him no, we just moved in and there were never any real doors on the second floor. He shrugged, said maybe it was just old damage from moisture, but he wasn't sure. He gave us a quote for repairs. I told him we'd get back to him. I felt dread when I thought about fixing that frame. I had this feeling that changing it might stir things up even more. My fiancée felt the same. She said, "I think we should leave that one for last." I nodded. We focused on the other rooms instead. We replaced some drywall in the hallway. We put in new windows in the master bedroom. We installed a new floor in the living room. Each time we spent a night there, I braced myself for another slam. Sometimes we heard it, sometimes we didn't. The times we heard it, it came with that same rush of cold air. It always sounded like it was somewhere in the upstairs hallway, but we never found any new evidence. The handprints stayed the same, though I ran my hand over them often, convinced I felt a slight difference over time. I tried to stay rational. I checked weather reports. I checked how the wind might affect the house. I tested each window. None of it explained the force or the location of that sound. My fiancée refused to stay in the house alone, and I didn't blame her. My nerves were on edge too. One evening around 8 p.m., we were just cleaning up brushes after a day of painting. Suddenly, that slam shook the floor beneath us. It was so loud that I dropped a paint tray. It splattered on the plastic sheeting, sending little droplets everywhere. My fiancée swore under her breath. I felt an instant headache form, a pounding in my temples. I ran upstairs, flashlight in hand, yelling, "Who's there?" I heard my own voice echo. Silence. The frame stood there like empty doorways. The wooden floors were bare. Our footprints in the dust were the only marks. That same cold draft hit me in the face, making my eyes water. I looked at the handprint frame. My heart thumped. The marks were still there, no deeper than before, but that entire area felt charged with energy. After that, we took a break for a week. We told ourselves we needed a mental rest. We slept at our apartment. We tried to forget about the slamming door and the freezing air, but the house was ours. We couldn't ignore it forever. Finally, we returned to keep going with the renovations. We started focusing on the downstairs bathroom, the front porch, and the exterior paint. We avoided staying past sunset for a while. We arrived in the morning and left before dusk. That helped our nerves, but the project moved slower. I still can't decide if we should replace that frame or leave it as is. Part of me wants to seal it up, patch it, paint over it, and pretend it doesn't exist. Another part of me worries that might provoke whatever force is causing those slams. Each time I set foot on the second floor, I feel a tightness in my chest. I keep expecting a rush of cold air and a bang that makes me jump. The tension stays with me, hour after hour, until I leave. My fiancée feels the same. We started calling it the haunted frame in private. We don't tell friends or family about it because we don't want them to think we're paranoid. But the fear is real. We're still working on the rest of the house. The living room is now painted. The kitchen has new cabinets, and the front porch is reinforced. But we haven't touched that room upstairs. We haven't replaced the missing door there, and we haven't sanded the frame any further. We still see those handprints each time we pass by. They're there, pressed into the wood, proof that something isn't right. I don't know what's going to happen when we finally start remodeling that upstairs room. We want to turn it into a guest bedroom, or maybe an office. We'll have to deal with that doorway at some point. I keep telling myself we'll do it soon, but part of me keeps putting it off. I worry that once we install a new door, we'll hear it slam in the middle of the night, over and over. Maybe the handprints will appear on the new door too. Maybe the sounds will get worse. My fiancé shares those concerns. For now, we're focusing on the ground floor. We say we'll get to the upstairs later. Still, every time we pack up our tools at the end of the day and get in the car, we look up at that second floor window. We watch the house. It looks normal from the outside. Just an old building with some fresh paint and new windows. No sign of anything odd. Yet I remember that slam. I remember shining a flashlight on that door frame. I remember the cold draft that stung my face. I remember the dusty impressions, shaped like hands pressed into the wood. And I know there's something there that won't rest easy, no matter how many coats of paint we use or how many new doors we hang. We just live with that uncertainty, trying to make the place our home while ignoring the feeling that it doesn't want us to. I still remember the first night it happened. I was in my living room staring at the clock on the wall. The ticking noise felt too loud, and I couldn't shake off a strange restlessness. My radio was on the side table next to me, turned low, playing a local rock station I'd been listening to for years. It was a typical Tuesday. I was about to get ready for bed when the music stopped without warning. There was a brief silence, followed by static. At first I thought it was just a temporary glitch. I waited, but the static continued. Then I heard a voice that didn't match any station I normally tune into. It sounded old, like a broadcast from decades ago. That night, I only caught a sentence or two. Something about a forklift accident on March 22nd, 1970 near the industrial district. My chest got tight, and my hands felt clammy. I turned the dial, but I couldn't get rid of the static. A second later, the radio popped back to my usual station. The announcer was giving the weather forecast just like normal. I sat there breathing hard, unsure if I'd imagined the entire thing. I went to bed feeling wired, thinking I must have been half asleep and mistaken the noise for something else. But 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, I was in the kitchen making a sandwich. I keep my radio on the counter because I like some background music while I cook. Suddenly, the volume dropped, then spiked to static. My first reaction was to tap the radio on the side, hoping it was just a loose cable or something. Then a voice came through. It was scratchy but clear enough to make out. "This is Harriet Campbell reporting from the scene on Maplewood Road. A large forklift crashed into the eastern side of a warehouse around 6:15 p.m. Several people were injured and..." Then it cut off, back to static. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. I turned off the radio completely and waited a few seconds. When I turned it back on, it was back to normal, playing a cheerful pop song that had nothing to do with forklift accidents or 1970. I stood there, eyes on the radio, trying to make sense of it. A forklift accident? Injuries? A date from 50-something years ago? I didn't feel hungry anymore. I left the sandwich on the counter, went to the living room, and sat down with my phone. My mind was racing. I typed "forklift accident 1970 Maplewood Road" into a search engine, but nothing came up. I tried a few variations, but still found no detailed record. My stomach was in knots. Why was I hearing something about an incident from that year? And why was the radio doing this only at night? Over the next few days, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was an odd interference. I told myself to ignore it, but the radio didn't let me ignore it. The strange broadcast came back several times, always late in the evening or at night, never during the day. Each time I caught more details. I heard the name of the company that owned the warehouse. I heard references to a few injured workers. No mention of fatalities. The voice always sounded the same. That same old-time newscaster tone, calm and precise, reporting facts as if they were current events. Each time I tried to record it on my phone, the static disappeared the second I hit the record button. The normal station music or talk show would blast in my ears, making me jump. When I stopped recording, the static or the old broadcast would sometimes come back. That started to unnerve me more than anything else. It was like it knew I was trying to capture proof. It felt personal, like the broadcast was aware of what I was doing. After 2 weeks, my sleep got worse. I kept imagining the radio switching itself on in the middle of the night and broadcasting that scratchy news report about an accident from 50 years ago. One night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to relax. My breath felt shallow, and my palms started sweating. I got up, walked to the living room, and turned the radio dial to my favorite station. I wanted to see if it would switch again. I sat down on my couch, phone in hand, prepared to record. The night was quiet, and I could hear the low hum of the fridge in the kitchen. For half an hour, nothing happened, just the usual late-night call-in show. Then around midnight, the static crackled. My throat went dry. I pressed the record button, heart pounding. The static stopped. Dead silence. I let go of the record button, and the static came back instantly, followed by the old broadcast. It felt like a game of cat and mouse. I couldn't catch it. I heard Harriet Campbell's voice again. Company spokesperson said the damage to the warehouse was extensive. Workers at the scene have been taken to the local clinic for treatment. No serious harm has been reported. Officials are still investigating the cause. Back to you, David. Then static. Then my regular station's commercials. My head was spinning. I felt goosebumps across my arms. I couldn't stop thinking about that forklift, the injured workers, the specific location. It always mentioned Maplewood Road, always the same date, the same approximate time. There was a sense of urgency in the broadcast, but it never lasted long enough for me to gather new details. I wanted to figure out if this was real, or if I was losing my mind. I ended up calling a local historical society. A woman answered the phone. I asked if she had any record of an accident involving a forklift at a warehouse on Maplewood Road in 1970. I didn't mention the radio. I just said I was doing a personal project on local industrial incidents from that era. She sounded polite, but said she had no records of a forklift accident on Maplewood Road that year. She did mention that many archives from the 1970s weren't fully digitized, though. She suggested I check old local newspapers on microfilm at the library. The next day, I took off work and headed to the main library. I felt a little shaky, maybe from lack of sleep or maybe from some deeper sense of unease. My stomach churned as I walked through the rows of microfilm machines. I found reels from 1970 and started scanning them. I spent hours looking at headlines and articles from early to mid-1970. Nothing about a forklift crash on Maplewood Road. No mention of a Harriet Campbell. No mention of that company name. I was relieved and confused at the same time. If there was no historical record, why was my radio talking about it? When I got home that evening, the sun was setting behind my neighbor's roof, and the sky had a faint purple tint. I felt drained. I closed my door, locked it, and put my radio in a closet. I decided not to turn it on at all that night. I was tired of hearing the same weird news bulletin. Around 10 o'clock, I walked to my bedroom. I tried to read a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the hallway, where the closet was. I couldn't stop thinking about the broadcast. I started sweating and my heart beat faster. I wanted to make sure it was still off. I went to the closet, pulled the door open, and stared at the radio in the corner. It was dark and silent. I felt a slight wave of relief. I closed the closet again and headed to the bathroom. I splashed some cold water on my face, dried off, and stepped back into the hallway. That's when I heard static, faint, like someone whispering through a sock. My chest tightened. The static was coming from behind the closet door. I reached for the doorknob with a shaky hand. My breathing got shallow. I opened the door. The radio was on even though I'd turned it off and unplugged it. The little red power indicator was glowing. My arms went cold. I heard the broadcast again, the same woman's voice. Officials say cleanup is underway. Damages are estimated at around $10,000. Injuries appear to be minor, but some employees will need physical therapy to recover from bruising and sprains. I stood there in the doorway, my body tense. She went on. A witness described hearing a loud crash. The forklift operator lost control and the vehicle tipped sideways. The operator refused medical attention, insisting he was fine, though paramedics recommended a thorough check. I clenched my jaw. This was the most detail I'd heard yet. Then it cut to static, then silence. No usual station. I stared at the radio, trying to process what I'd heard. The forklift operator was apparently not seriously hurt, but there were multiple people with injuries. My head spun with questions. Why was this happening in my house? Why me? I grabbed my phone and called a friend of mine named Mark. He's the only person I trust with weird stuff. He listened to my story, but I could tell he was skeptical. He suggested I replace the radio or throw it out. Part of me wanted to. Part of me felt compelled to keep it around. Maybe I was hoping for a clue that would explain everything. Over the next few nights, I tried a different approach. I placed the radio next to an old digital recorder I'd found in my closet. I wanted to see if the digital recorder would pick up anything when the phone couldn't. On Thursday night, the broadcast returned around 11 p.m., but the recorder just got static. The same voice was coming through the radio speaker, but the recording later played back as empty hiss. Nothing helpful. I felt more frustrated each time. It was like chasing a ghost signal. One night I decided to talk to the voice. I know that sounds strange, but I was desperate. The radio switched over to static around midnight. The voice started its usual script. I stood there, leaning in close, heart pounding, and said, "Hello? Can you hear me? Why are you telling me about this accident?" Of course, there was no direct response. The broadcast kept going, describing a short press conference from 1970. But after the broadcast ended and the static lingered, I heard something new. A different voice, lower, maybe male, mumbling something I couldn't make out. It lasted about 2 seconds. Then it vanished, replaced by my normal station. I felt a chill in my arms and a tingling in my scalp. I sank into a chair, my muscles weak. The next day I called Mark again and told him about the new voice. He said maybe it was random interference or a shortwave channel crossing signals. I wanted to believe that, but it didn't feel random. It felt intentional. I kept trying to piece things together. An accident happened, or maybe didn't happen, in 1970. Harriet Campbell was the reporter. There was a forklift operator who refused medical attention. There was a warehouse on Maplewood Road. Injuries, but no deaths. The radio was fixated on these details. I tried to see if Harriet Campbell was a real person. I searched old phone books, old newspaper staff lists. I found one mention of a Harriet Campbell in a 1970 phone directory from a nearby city, but it said she was a lab technician, not a reporter. That might have been someone else entirely. My frustration kept growing. I started feeling edgy all the time, like I was carrying a weight on my shoulders. Every time night came, I braced myself for the static. One Friday evening, I decided to do something bold. I drove to Maplewood Road, near the industrial district, just to see if there was a warehouse that matched the broadcast. I found a row of old buildings, some still in use, some abandoned. The area was quiet. I walked around, peering at faded signs. There was a building with loading docks and a worn-out sign referencing a distribution company that could have operated in the 1970s. But I saw no forklift. There was no plaque or marker about an accident. It felt like a dead end. I drove home with a headache. That night, the radio switched again. The broadcast repeated part of the same script about the crash. My chest felt tight, and I noticed my arms shaking. I forced myself to keep calm. When the broadcast ended, I switched off the radio before it could return to normal stations. I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about who might be sending this message. It was the same question again and again. Why me? Why now? I never got a solid answer. Over the following weeks, the strange broadcasts kept happening. Sometimes I'd hear new details about the forklift operator or a manager from the warehouse. Other times it was just the same lines repeated. I tried everything. New cables, a new plug, even moving the radio to my garage. Nothing changed. The broadcast still found its way through. One time, the radio had no power source at all, and it still produced faint static and that same old voice. Every time I tried to record with modern devices, it vanished. I started feeling a knot in my stomach every evening, waiting for it. Eventually, I stopped trying to fight it. I let the radio do what it does. I listened carefully, hoping for a final clue. One night, I heard the entire broadcast from start to finish, about 2 minutes of details, ending with Harriet Campbell saying, "This has been WHPL Evening News, March 22nd, 1970. Then silence. I whispered, "Is that it?" No answer, just emptiness. I waited another hour, but it never came back that night. I felt shaky relief, like maybe that was the final transmission. Maybe it was done. But I still keep the radio in my house. Sometimes it goes quiet for weeks, then the static comes back and I hear Harriet's voice again, as if I'm stuck in a loop. I don't know if I'll ever solve the mystery. I just know that my radio isn't normal anymore. When someone asks why I seem on edge at night, I don't tell them everything. I just say I have trouble sleeping. If they ever heard that broadcast themselves, I'm sure they'd feel the same sense of dread and confusion that I do. For now, I live with it. Part of me believes there's a reason I'm hearing these old news reports, something important I'm supposed to find. Maybe one day I'll understand it. Until then, I keep my radio off most nights. But I still hear static sometimes, faint and distant, creeping through the walls whenever the world goes quiet. And in those moments, I hold my breath, hoping I won't hear that voice again, but half expecting it to return at any second. I still remember the jolt in my chest when I saw that shadow. It was late, my roommate and I were tired, and our dorm room felt smaller than ever. I want to share every detail, because I can't shake the feeling that something in that place was watching us. We weren't the type to believe in ghosts or anything like that. We were just two guys trying to get through a semester without failing. But that night, everything changed for me. I moved into that dorm at the start of the semester. My parents helped me carry in a few boxes, my laptop and a suitcase of clothes. The room was on the third floor of an old building on campus. It had 2 single beds pushed against opposite walls, a tall wooden closet with a big mirror on one door, and a desk near the window. The walls were off-white, and the fluorescent light overhead always flickered for a second before turning on. The floor made a dull creak every time I walked from the door to my bed. My roommate Matt arrived about an hour after I did. We shook hands, introduced ourselves, and spent a few minutes deciding who would take which bed. I chose the one by the window because I liked the breeze at night. Matt seemed quiet but friendly, and we got along from the start. By the second month, we had settled into a routine. We went to classes, ate at the cafeteria, watched TV shows on my laptop at night, and sometimes went out for coffee with people from our floor. The building always felt a little run down. The stairs were narrow and the hallway lights were on timers, so if you didn't move around, they'd shut off. I'd come home late some nights and see only a dim emergency light near the elevator. Everything else would be dark, and I'd walk to my room with my phone's flashlight on. Some folks said the place was historic, but to me, it just felt old. I never heard about anything strange in that building until the night we saw the shadow. It started as a normal evening. Matt and I were at our desks working on a presentation for one of our classes. We had a small reading lamp on, plus the overhead light. It was around 11 p.m., and the dorm was mostly quiet. We could hear faint music from the room next door and some laughter from down the hall, but nothing too loud. I remember feeling a bit restless because the deadline for our project was coming up. Matt was typing on his laptop and I was flipping through notes trying to decide how to organize our slides. At one point, I stood up to stretch. My back was stiff from sitting too long. I walked a few steps and faced the mirror on the closet door. I was about to run my hand through my hair when I saw it. In the reflection, I saw the shape of someone moving behind Matt and me. It was faint, like a dark outline, but it was definitely there. My first thought was that maybe someone had opened the door and walked in, but the door was closed and our room wasn't big enough for someone to slip in quietly. I stayed still, watching the mirror. My heart started pounding, and my mouth felt dry. Matt noticed something off in my expression, so he turned his head and asked, "What's up?" I raised my hand, gesturing for him to look at the mirror. He twisted around in his chair, and we both stared at the reflection. That shape slid from one side of the room to the other, behind us. We saw it for maybe 2 seconds. Then it was gone. I spun around fast, expecting to see someone right there. There was nothing. The room looked the same as always. Our beds, our desk chairs, some clothes on the floor, and the closet. My heart was racing so fast I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I felt a chill on my arms and a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Matt stood up too. He glanced around, opened the closet door, and even looked under the beds. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. And even if there had been, there was no way they could have left without us hearing the door open or close. I didn't say much at first. I was too startled. Matt muttered something about maybe the overhead light playing tricks on our eyes, or maybe it was a shadow from the hallway. But the hallway light was off, and we had locked the door. We tried to ignore it, but a tension settled in the room. Every small sound made me jump. Our conversation died down. I could sense Matt was just as uneasy as I was, because he kept looking at the mirror. I couldn't bring myself to look at it anymore. The sight of that dark outline replayed in my mind again and again. We decided we couldn't handle the darkness that night. Even though the overhead light was still on, it felt too dim. Matt went over and switched on the lamp by his bed, and I turned on the desk lamp too. The room became bright, but my nerves didn't settle. I sat down on my bed, and Matt sat on his. For a few seconds, we just listened. The silence was thick. We could hear our own breathing and the hum of the dorm building's old pipes. I felt goosebumps on my arms. My palms were sweaty. Matt muttered he wasn't tired anymore. I felt the same. That weird electric feeling of dread wouldn't go away. Finally, Matt suggested we keep the door open. I agreed without hesitating. When I opened the door, a bit of light from the hallway spilled into our room. The corridor was empty. I looked around, half expecting to see someone lurking near the stairs, but it was just that dull hallway with chipped paint and a couple of closed doors. We kept our door propped open with a shoe. It sounds silly, but that tiny connection to the hallway made us feel less isolated. I leaned against the doorway for a while, watching the quiet corridor. After a few minutes, I stepped back inside, leaving the door open. We talked in low voices about what we had seen. I told Matt I was sure it was a shape of a person. Matt agreed. He said he couldn't make out any features or clothing, but it definitely moved. I noticed that my stomach felt tense and my shoulders were stiff. I couldn't relax. Eventually, we tried to lie down. We didn't turn off any lights. That night, I slept with my shoes on the floor right next to my bed, ready to get up if I had to. I tossed and turned, hearing every click and creak in the hallway. Matt coughed now and then, but neither of us spoke much. I don't think I slept more than 2 or 3 hours. The next morning, I woke up with a sore neck. Matt was already up, sitting at his desk, checking something on his phone. There were dark circles under his eyes. He turned to me and said, "We need to ask around about this place." We grabbed a quick breakfast in the cafeteria and then spent part of the day talking to a few people from our floor. At first, nobody mentioned anything strange about our room. But when we asked about odd experiences in the building in general, one guy on the 4th floor shrugged and said he'd heard rumors about something weird that happened to a resident years back. He didn't know details, just that the resident left suddenly, and people whispered about strange noises in that room afterward. It was never officially confirmed by the school, so it stayed as gossip passed among older students. Apparently, some people even asked to switch rooms after staying there, though he wasn't sure which room it was. We also talked to a friend of Matt's who had been at the university longer. She said the building had a reputation for being creepy. Students sometimes claimed they heard footsteps at night when nobody was around. Some people in other wings said they saw doors open on their own. She'd never seen anything herself, but she didn't seem surprised when we told her about our experience. She guessed it was the same room people whispered about. though she didn't recall anyone describing a shadow exactly like the one we saw. That evening, Matt and I went back to our room with mixed feelings. We weren't sure how to act. Everything looked normal in the daylight. The faint flicker of the overhead light didn't seem so ominous at 4 in the afternoon. I stood by the mirror and stared, trying to see if the shape could have been a reflection of something. Maybe a coat hanging off the chair or a shadow from the desk lamp. But we didn't have anything in that position. There was no coat or towel that could cast a person-shaped outline. Matt tapped his foot impatiently, watching me check every angle. We came up empty. That night, we tried to keep our routine as normal as possible. We ordered pizza and invited a friend over. We didn't talk about the shadow while he was there. We laughed at random jokes, ate our pizza, and watched some videos on my laptop. Our friend left around 10 p.m. Then we faced that moment again. Lights out or lights on? We looked at each other and Matt said, "I'm not sleeping in the dark." I nodded and replied, "Me neither." We left the overhead light on as well as the desk lamp. It felt silly, like we were kids scared of the boogeyman, but I preferred looking stupid over feeling that dread again. Even with all the lights shining, I couldn't stop thinking about the reflection. Each time I moved my eyes near that mirror, I half expected to see a dark figure behind me. I felt a knot in my stomach, my muscles tensing in waves. I tried to distract myself with a game on my phone, but my mind kept drifting. Around midnight, I laid down and pulled the blanket up to my chest. I closed my eyes, but every small noise in the hallway made me open them again. I felt sweaty, even though the room was cool. Sometime after 1 a.m., Matt whispered, "I heard something." I got up on my elbows, heartbeat thumping, and strained my ears. The hallway was quiet. Our door was half open. I saw the faint light from the corridor. Then I heard a shuffle, like a footstep on the old linoleum floor. It sounded close to our doorway. Matt and I locked eyes. We stayed silent. I swallowed hard and got up. My legs felt weak, but I walked to the door and peeked into the hallway. Nothing. Just the same chipped paint walls and a couple of closed doors. My heart was pounding. I shut the door this time and locked it. Matt asked why I was locking it if we had been trying to keep it open. I told him I felt safer with it locked now because if there was something out there, I didn't want it walking in. We didn't argue. We just accepted the uneasy feeling. In the morning, we barely spoke as we got ready for class. Both of us felt drained. We left the room together and stepped into the hallway. Some folks were leaving their rooms, yawning or zipping up backpacks. We tried to act normal, but I noticed we were glancing at each other, probably thinking the same thing. We couldn't forget that shape in the mirror or the noises we heard at night. We managed to get through our classes, but my focus was shot. I kept replaying the events in my head, wondering if I was imagining things or if something was really there. When our project deadline passed, we still had the same routine. Come back to the dorm, chat a bit, watch a movie or something, and then try to sleep with every light on. The tension didn't vanish. It clung to us. We asked a few more people about the building. One person on the first floor said they'd heard about weird sensations in certain rooms like cold spots or sudden drafts. Another person told us they saw a dark shape in a stairwell once, but they assumed it was a reflection or a trick of the light. I didn't tell them how similar that sounded to what we saw. I just nodded and pretended it was no big deal. I stopped wanting to look in the mirror at all. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection by accident and feel a burst of panic, expecting to see that shape. A couple of times I thought I saw movement behind me in the reflection, but when I turned around, nothing was there. It got so bad that I considered throwing a towel over that mirror, but I felt silly. Matt joked about covering it with a poster, but we never did. We just avoided looking directly at it if we could. Eventually, the nights calmed down a bit. We didn't see that shape again, and we didn't hear strange footsteps, but the memory of it stayed fresh. We never got a straight story from anyone. Apparently, a previous occupant left the building under unusual circumstances. No one knew if that was related or not. Some claimed it was the reason people felt uneasy in that particular room. Others said the building was old and old buildings always creak and have weird electrical quirks. Matt said maybe we were just tired that night, and our eyes played tricks on us, but he never sounded convinced. I moved out at the end of the semester, and Matt did the same. Neither of us wanted to stick around in that dorm. It wasn't the worst experience of my life, but it left me with an unsettling reminder that some things don't have simple explanations. I couldn't ignore what I saw. I remember the shape in the mirror, the immediate shock and the tightness in my chest. I remember the way Matt's face went pale and how we slept with the lights on. That moment never felt like a dream or a coincidence. It felt solid, like somebody was in the room with us. Today, when people ask me about scary experiences, I don't tell them some exaggerated ghost story. I just tell them what happened that night. I saw a shadow that had no source. We both saw it. It moved behind us in a small locked room. We never figured out who or what it was, but it felt real. I still get chills when I think about it. If someone asked me to spend another night in that same dorm room, I'd say no way. I'd rather sleep in my car. I can handle normal college stress, but that was different. Even now, the memory makes my stomach tighten and my hands shake. I guess some things just can't be explained.